everyone. So we have somewhat limited time. Some new folks have joined. This has sort of been put together somewhat quickly, but I'm happy that it has been established. Yes, so we have two objectives. One, I think, is to sort of talk about a reading list of how we might, I think, generate a better appreciation of this text, in the sense that actually a lot to read about the Marquis de Sade's political, social context. Um, I think before even reading the text, although I think we can do both. I think we can sort of start by a slow and gradual line by line reading of the text and be sort of comfortable with the fact that we're not going to get that far into it, knowing that from like now till next week, what we can do is actually read a few extra things, including the Adorno and Horkheimer piece that I recommended from Dialectic of Enlightenment. It's extremely different than Lacan's orientation, obviously, because they have a very particular conception of reason, which is tied into this kind of post Max Weber idea of instrumentalized reason. And so, number one. Number two, they're dealing with the question of reason, the Enlightenment, and fascism, which I think is actually very, very, very much different than the sort of very specific social and political context that Lacan is dealing with this text. And towards that end, by the way, there is a fabulous kind of secondary piece of literature I want to recommend to you guys, which I was just actually reading on this that will give like a very good background. Let me just give you the reference, and I'm going to post it in the Discord as well. It's called The Self and Its Pleasures by Carolyn Dean. And this is very nice because it actually puts the essay in relationship to debates with left-wing French Nietzscheanism, believe it or not. Because, one of the figures that had written about the Marquis de Sade, of course, is this guy, Pierre Klosowski. And he is the figure who has this, pagan idea of the simulacra. And he is a very important sort of, I mean, he wrote a very important book on Nietzsche's concept of eternal return. And he had also written something on the Marquis de Sade. And then, of course, the other figure, of course, is George Bataille. Now, immediately it's interesting because Lacan has no Nietzschean commitments. I think my old professor, Farhang Irfani at American University, told me that he studied the references to Nietzsche in Lacan's work, and it only appears like 3 or 4 times. So Lacan has very distinct interests, I think, that are primarily clinical regarding why the Marquis de Sade matters. Although, as Luis articulates in his essay that I had a chance to read on Trump and de Sade, um, there's also an ethical issue, which is why I attached the ethics seminar. Even though this is not published at the time of the ethics seminar, this is actually published at the time of anxiety seminar. You'll remember that it is referenced, the themes are referenced a lot in the ethics seminar, because I would contend um, that primarily what's going on here is a very, very interesting sort of political commentary of ethics. And I think one of the things that is often overlooked, because I don't know if you guys have actually read um, Onward Frenchman, like that little section from Philosophy in the Bedroom. Have you guys had a chance to actually read it? It's worth reading because what we sort of get at here, uh, obviously, is before Lacan wants to formalize all of these things, is we get a clear sense actually of what the Marquis de Sade's political agenda is. And it's very clear, actually. His political agenda is based on a kind of contention, right? That there's something fundamentally unfinished in the French Revolutionary tradition, and that in order for the Republican tradition to sort of stay true to itself, they need to invent a kind of revised theory of Jacobin citizenship into what the Marquis de Sade calls libertinism. So it's a kind of plea for the libertine. Um, and he's using this as a very specific historical, and this is where Nietzsche would come in, of course. He's using this as a very specific historical question of virtue ethics, actually, right? Because he's wanting to say that there's a deep flaw in social contract theory that is actually perverting virtue. And that flaw has everything to do with theism of Christianity. So you could say that he's sort of an atheist, but it's actually not accurate to call him an atheist, I think, because he's valorizing a very particular set of Roman, like you see, like this. If you read other parts of philosophy in the bedroom, he's valorizing the kind of the mystery cults and initiation into like Venus, all of that kind of stuff. And one of the things he's trying to put forward is this idea that Christianity almost thinks a type of individualism, which undermines its own. And this is something that I think is the heart of what Lacan is trying to get at, right? But what I'm trying to say to you is that, like, you guys should really read up on his criticism of Christianity because it is actually deeply thorough and very, very compelling and interesting. That's all like a little bit of a side point. I don't know. Maybe we could actually start by getting a sense of where people are coming from with this, and we could go around since we have. I know Andrew has his hand up, but we have new members. We can hear from Sanjay, Matilda, Matan, Luis, Akshay, Jonas. Just like briefly, maybe you could say a little bit about the text if you've read Kant with Sade before, and also what you want to get out of this particular reading. Let's start with Andrew, then we'll go in order.
Yeah, I did actually have a question, but I could probably put that aside, just to kind of get at like what you're posing. I have read this text. It's been a while since I've read it, so my memory about it is a bit vague, but I have read some of the pieces of reference to in Seminar 7. I would say one of the things that I'd hope to gain from the text would be just the sort of understanding of perversion in Lacan and the way it differs from, let's say, the way perversion was clinically characterized in all the analytic traditions that he's polemicizing against. Lacan is not only just a matter of teaching, but also he's contending with the contemporary zeitgeist of psychoanalytic theory and practice with the IPA. And then also just, yeah, I think one of the things, and maybe this can tie with my question, is just like the political orientation of Sade. Because I
Yeah.
think you had said that, like, the French, specifically Klosowski, and the French Nietzscheans kind of aligned Sadean libertinism with the sort of nihilism tradition, but it seems like, yeah, it's one of actually a republic of libertines. And it's interesting to hear you say that, like, from your understanding, that he's trying to work through the failures of Jacobinism as like an unfinished project, which would make me think it's like, is it the problem of liberty, equality, and fraternity for him, where he thinks that there's something different, especially with this idea of virtue ethics being impure by the long thread of thought. It makes me think of
Yeah.
this like as a like as a sort of ethics of self-care,
Hmm.
in the sense that's more of pleasure, like the distribution of pleasure among bodies of men, right?
Yeah, it's
As
exactly.
bodies as in the state, but also, with the other. Um, it's like the inversion of Kantian deontology, right?
Well, I mean, that's actually part of the thing. I'm not sure it's so much of an inversion of Kant as it is literally Kantianism,
Mm,
taking a non-empirical basis of a new logic of decisionism, political decisionism, which is allowing for the radicalism of liberty in particular. He's privileging liberty. He's saying that Christianity has not been sublated. Christianity has not been overcome by the revolution. And Christianity is impeding. the otherwise righteous universalism of these. So famously, as a side point, I don't know if you guys knew this, but it is essential. He's imprisoned for 26 years of his life, and he read Kant's critique when he was imprisoned. Incidentally, he's imprisoned symbolically in the Bastille, which is very interesting. Which, of course, they have that painting of him. I think he's reading the book while he's chained. Um, so people have made the claim that uh, it's an inversion of Kant. Now we're going to get to what Lacan thinks about that. It's very, very layered. We'll wait a moment to elaborate all of that, obviously. But as I read it, this particular little manifesto, Onward Frenchman, I mean, by the way, this notion of onward is very important because it has a telos. He's saying something that there is a teleology of revolution that has to be furthered, that has to be continued. Uh, but again, I'm not sure if I want to use the term inverted, but there is a sense that the direction of the Jacobin movement needs to be reoriented in order for the virtues, and also really in order for the primary impediment to be overcome, which is what Christianity does to the body. But what Christianity does to the body is also uh, something that the social contract cannot resolve, because uh, it's not exactly clear that Kantian ethics is in line with social contract ethics, right? Um, it's an ethics of the imperative, right? Kantian ethics is an ethics of the imperative, and it's an ethics of the ought. Okay. Um, so I find Kantian ethics very, very compelling, and I find it actually like a lot of Marxists are highly critical of Kantian ethics, but I don't know how much you guys have studied. Who here has actually studied Kantian ethics? A little,
Um,
a little. Yeah. Okay. So that's something that we can actually breach. But let's continue. Let's go to Luis, then Sanjay.
Oh, you just raised my hand to say me, like study content ethics.
Oh,
Oh,
Eleanor
excellent.
didn't get a chance to speak. So,
Yeah, tell us your background with the text and all of that.
Um, well, I've read it once before. I guess my interest in rereading it is more related to clinical applications, particularly with my work in the justice system and with juvenile sex offenders, and how this text can be, and this notion of Kantian ethics could potentially be applied to my work there. Oh,
You're
I think
muted.
you're
Yeah,
muted.
that's fascinating. That, as a side point, Derek Cook does have a nice essay about perversion within the prison system. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with that?
I haven't read that, but I have read Stephanie Swale's book on perversion, and find that really helpful in my work.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Uh, it's about making oneself an instrument of the other's desire,
Mm.
and therefore making oneself into the object A. And what I find interesting about that is that rights and harm, like the ethics of harm and all of that, victim, the status of what a victim is, and all of that, um, falls by the wayside. And so
Mm.
you have a logical exposition that the Marquis de Sade is elaborating, where he's trying to make a claim that all of this utilitarian empiricism about harm uh, falls out, can be circumvented. And it's just very interesting to me. It's very interesting to me also in the Nietzschean sense that yes, if he is correct, what that really means is that one must do a thorough purging of all instantiations of Christianity on ethics, which would include utilitarianism. That was Nietzsche's point about utilitarian ethics as well, right? Because there's a huge motif in Lacan that I've studied about utilitarian ethics, because at first blush, of course, you would have to recognize that psychoanalysis will have to make a very, very important claim on utilitarian ethics, because utilitarian ethics in general follows the maxim that ethics should be geared towards the maximization of pleasure in all instances, and they have this basic idea that sort of like the limits of pleasure and pain are all that we can know. So there's also like this like skepticism going on, and also like a kind of anti-rationalism going on there. So it's often, I think utilitarianism is quite a vulgar form of ethics. It's kind of like pathetic in a certain way. Because Lacan has this whole motif. I don't know if you guys remember it on Jeremy Bentham versus Lacan or versus Kant. That might be a good way for us to make a contrast between Kantian ethics and utilitarian ethics at some point. Because, of course, if you read the Dialectics of Enlightenment, Adorno, and if you read Adorno's lectures on morality, what does Adorno say is the implicit end of Kantian ethics? It's the fascist police. It's like Kantian ethics also contains a monstrous instrumentalized danger itself to become sort of overrun.
Wasn't that the Hannah Arendt argument as well with Eichmann in Jerusalem?
Yeah, it's sort of. Yeah, close to it, I think. Yeah. So there's a lot we can read about Kantian ethics that would be quite useful. But Luis, tell us about your background.
Well, I am working right now on, I hope some of you read that I wrote this. First, I'm sorry, I didn't have time to finish writing it. I actually only wrote the introduction like some weeks ago, and today I finished writing the rest. And because I had a friend come in to visit and have other things to do that I didn't expect, so I didn't have time to finish. But well, I'm working on expanding, using this to expand into my work in my dissertation, right? About Kant and Lacan, especially focusing on the voice of reason that is central to Kant, right? And from which we have Lacan, because something that I think literature has not really paid too much attention is that the fact that Kant avec comes when Lacan is doing Seminar 10 on anxiety, and this is when he introduces the voice as an object of the drive, right? And how central that is for Kant avec right? Even if he himself is not clear, because this is at the beginning of this seminar 10, right? Because at the end, the voice comes at the end of Seminar 10, right? So Lacan is already constructing. Of course, the idea of the voice is doesn't alone is come in Seminar 10. The voice is before, but it's not understood as an object of drive. It is only understood as an object of drive in Seminar 10, right? So before that, it is only understood as a leftover of a speech, right? So yeah, my work is on that, and yeah. Oh, something that I wanted to comment is that I think both Kant and Sade are contradictory, and this is what I think Lacan is trying to point out, right? That well, Kant represses desire, Sade represses the law, right? And this is something they share in common. And I see that, of course, Sade is a pervert. Well, Kant is a neurotic, right? And I think that's crucial to understand the difference between the two of them, right? And how they both structurally refer to the voice with their own pathological characteristic as neurotic or pervert, right?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Luis. Yeah, Tracy McNulty makes a nice point that in perversion, you can understand perversion clinically as an effort of structured on the avoidance of anxiety.
Could I ask the both of you, like, why do you think he's a pervert?
Sad?
Yes.
Well, I mean, well, of course, we will read that in the text, but it's a pervert precisely more than anything else because he represses the law, right? So by that, he's repressing castration. And then he shows that, well, of course, Lacan will show that Sade in his novels is not aware of that because Sade in his novels only depicts the hero as sadist, right? But in his life, actually, Sade was positioning himself as the object of the mother, right? And there is this relationship with the mother-in-law, right, in which he becomes the object, right? And this is, of course, goes back to the idea that the pervert refuses castration or disavows castration to become the object of the other, right? So in that sense, the pervert knows very well what the other wants, right? Precisely to keep the other non-castrated, right? And this is how precisely he has this vision of nature, right? And he has very clear ideas like Nietzsche too of what it is the the ethics of nature, right? Nature is cruel and cold, right? And he has no doubts about how we should act, right? Either it's just cruelty, coldness, right? Violence, and that's it, right?
No, but I mean, that's very persuasive. It's, I guess I'm just wondering because that sort of shifts the terrain to the biographical side rather than the kind of the text. And I mean, and I wonder about this question of is he really repressing the law insofar as like, how law-like his commitment to enjoyment kind of like is. That said, I haven't actually read this text, so I will leave it to your more authoritative opinion.
Oh, no, yeah, this is exactly what Lacan tries to point out, right? That although he's rejecting the law, he nonetheless following the law, right? Yeah.
Luis, I just want to say I really like what you said about the voice, and it makes me think of. So I just got 120 Days of Sodom, and I'm probably weird for trying to delve into that, and I've pushed it back because it's very unhinged. But I've watched Pasolini's rendition of it, and it's so interesting. The woman that is supposed to invoke the sadistic or perverse acts is merely speaking of all these traumatic events. Well, we would deem traumatic, sexually traumatic, but she's finding pleasure in recounting, and they're getting sort of seduced by this voice to sort of repeat the acts to their victims. So I really think that's interesting that you pointed out the relationship between the drive and the voice. And of course, I think Pasolini is really great by making them fascist rather than just rich libertines.
Yeah, and precisely because it's the voice that is the only way that you can set an imperative, right? So the voice is central in that way, right? Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's hear from Sanjay, then Matilda.
Hey, so I'm an econ major, undergraduate. I haven't read kind of Vaxad except just now when I skimmed it. What I have read on perversion was by Masood Khan, a psychoanalyst from the um object relations school. And yeah, that's like I haven't read a lot of Lacan actually.
Nice. It's good to have you.
It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So yes, I think again, I do want to take this text kind of slow, if it's okay.
I
If
have
we could.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
Is the pervert trying to be the phallus for the mother or the object of the mother?
Mm,
Because if it's trying to get what the other desires, then that's like the phallus, right?
yeah, I think that's a good question. Uh, I mean, in a technical sense, the pervert is trying to um like in for Lacan, he says that the pervert aims to merge both the being and the having of the phallus into one, and that they insist upon the castration of an other in order to avoid their own castration, right?
Right.
So, as it pertains to the mother, it it the sort of fantasy revolves around um, a pure blissful submersion, like the Marquis de Sade. I always loved this story. Uh, like whenever you see nature in his work, especially in philosophy in the bedroom, I think you can symbolize it with mother. And when
Mm-hmm.
he died, he said he wanted to be buried in an unmarked grave so that
Mm-hmm.
his signifier of his name would be completely forgotten and fully submerged with nature.
Fascinating.
Right. So, uh, we'll see how this works because it's a bit complicated because the pervert, what everything hinges upon is the phenomenology of the objects, right? So it's like this is why like all of these people are obsessed with de Sade, because what de Sade was trying to create was like an alternative um, investment into objects of enjoyment, the rights of enjoyment, um, by changing the composition of how we invest in objects of enjoyment in society, by creating new laws around our access to them, our rights to them, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's like a whole new reality that he tries to open up,
Mm-hmm.
based upon a new structure of the law as such. And so I think the text will elucidate this precise question about phallus, mother, fetish object, object A. All of these things will hopefully come into greater clarity as we
Mm-hmm.
proceed. I don't know if anybody else wanted to add to that.
Yeah, we were just Eleanor and I were just kind of talking about that because Eleanor made the comment that I think in some sense, like with the status of the pervert, the phallus and objet can kind of have a sort of line of equivalency.
Yeah.
But I think in a sort of way to kind of be pedantic, I think in a sense the pervert wants to instantiate that there is a law of enjoyment qua phallus, and yet they instrumentalize it
Yeah.
superheroically, but maintain a level in which they are, in some sense, like whether it's the sadist or let's say the exhibitionist, this sort of or no, not exhibition, the voyeur, as like this sort of neutral instantiation to where they're a pure gaze, and they're subjecting a split subject to this enjoyment while evoking whether it's the name of the Father or the big other, because that's why Lacan says they're the bearers of faith. And so, for instance, if you look at Pascal, right, even though he is a man of God, he's a Jansenist in his wager. It's almost like he's a sort of pure subject or pure gaze to evoke the other and the subject in the wager, right? By bearing faith. And that's what makes him a pervert in that sense. Whether he's a sadist or some sort of a voyeur in that sense, I'm not sure. But in a sense, the pervert has this sort of way in which they can be subjects under the law, but at the same time, their positioning in the act is sort of neutral, while they evoke the split subject who becomes castrated in that act and the other who enjoys, right?
Yeah. No, that's it's a very interesting operation that perversion has on intersubjectivity,
Mm-hmm.
on itself, right? Because in a certain way, uh, they objectivize the other in order to perform a certain operation on their own desire. And so this is also, I think, related to Lacan's idea that masochism and sadism are unified by the pervert. That's very important. Usually we think that there's a sadistic act and a masochistic act, but in fact, in perversion, they're subsumed into one. Yeah. And then if you read de Sade, we can see, it's very interesting that Akshay questions whether de Sade is a pervert. At first blush, one would think that it's obvious that he is. Just if you read his prescriptions, his political prescriptions in the manifesto. And again, I really think it's obvious that that manifesto, Onward Frenchmen, once more Frenchmen, is a very Lacanian manifesto. Is he not saying encore? Is he not saying more? Right? He's saying like he's implicitly referencing jouissance itself. He's implicitly referencing the problem of the death drive. You know what I'm saying? As that which is unfinished in the revolutionary thrust itself. That's the big thing that I think a lot of commentators miss, is that, yeah, de Sade is treated as some sort of like exhibitionist and extremist and anti-normative, but also, like, I don't know, if you read him in this way as like a teleologist of the revolution, it hits a little different. Okay, who's next here? Let us go. Oh, Matilda.
I've never read this text before. Oh, okay, I read it. I had marked things in it, but I don't really remember reading it or understanding it the first time I tried. This time it's making a little more sense. I haven't finished it, so my imagination about what it is or could be is pretty unbounded. I feel like right now I'm thinking about like maybe Kant and Sade or de Sade are, it seems what's important to Lacan so far is that it's revealing the intervention of the signifier and the split subject or something. With regard to like maybe like who's performing the universe, like the law. It seems like humans can't really do it, perhaps. But nonetheless, the imperatives are being heard. So there is some subject that is like somehow that maybe it's the subject of the enunciation who somehow is like obeying the categorical imperatives or something. And that is like the other. And so I've been thinking about like the intervention of the signifier, the emergence of the other, who seems to be related to the superego, hearing these imperatives. So I've been thinking about law and like how language kind of, as we like acquire language, we acquire norms and laws. And I've just been thinking about that in general. And maybe how like there is a ranking of laws, you know, there's like, and maybe like the difference between like Freud and Lacan, like I was listening to like the future of an illusion, and like he talks about like the sum of imperatives as being the wealth of civilization, or the sum of prohibitions as being like a civilizational wealth that is like aside from scientific technological strength, and that, so I've been thinking about what we've been reading in 16 and 17 with regard to like the financial analogies, perhaps with regard to like civilizational wealth is frustrating because the prohibitions, although they are a part of this apparatus that allows for the wealth of civilization, they're frustrating. trying to perhaps bridge the gap in Lacan to like thinking about the laws. He doesn't seem like they're really related to like repressions and prohibitions. You know, it's like it's so far removed in like a linguistic language. It's a bit perplexing. So I've been thinking about law and perhaps like what's the relation of these imperatives to the legal apparatus? Like thinking more on a sociological level too. And just like the whole question of like the grounding of law and stuff. Anyway, I could get really abstract in general, but I think that's mostly what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, Adorno and Horkheimer spend a good deal of time discussing the way that Sade not only telegraphs the critique of pure reason, but also the What is Enlightenment essay by Kant, because he achieves, and this is something that Lacan, I think, hints at in his own way, but maybe differently than Adorno and Horkheimer. Sade achieves a truer establishment of the ethical subject, no longer reliant on authority. That's the key point. And he's saying directly to the Republican tradition, here is a better form of autonomy. But then the question of heteronomy emerges from a very mysterious place, precisely because I think Matilda is right, and there's a very strange metaphysical dimension going on there about superego and the precise way of how we are ventriloquizing or imbuing the law. It's not clear. And you'll remember in my experiences on the left and my interest in censorship, I wrote that essay on Marx and Kant and censorship. And it is very interesting that you'll remember in the What is Enlightenment essay by Kant, he does say that, yeah, society needs a literal embodiment of the censor. For Lacan, it's not even, or even for Freud, it's not necessary to have a censor, whether they be benevolent or dictatorial, because these functions like the voice and these structural functions like the signifier are already playing that role, which itself links psychoanalysis from sociology and puts us into a realm of a possible trap of idealism, right? Because again, I mean, if you look at like what Marxism has to say about the problems or the shortcomings of Kantian ethics, what is the problem? The problem is one of a historical specificity of the ought. If the ought is emerging in some ahistorical voice of authority, how does that permit us to think any historical change or mutation to the law? Is the law, therefore, now we can see the direct continuity of Kantian ethics to something like fascism or totalitarianism, whatever have you, right? So that's something, for example, that that Lukács is very critical of when it comes to Kantian ethics. Although at the same time, if you read Lucien Goldmann's book on Kant, he doesn't read Kant in that same way. So there's a multiplicity of readings of Kant. There may even be like a historical materialist way to read Kant's ethics. We'll see where Lacan takes this whole business. Those are not really concerns of Lacan. This question about so anyways, okay, please let's hear from Matan and then Andy.
Hey, hello everyone. I've done my my fair share of reading of Kant, avec, Sade, some of the Sade's books. I recently read a few months ago his Marquis de Grange, his one Gothic novel. It's pretty entertaining, and it plays out like a horror movie almost. There's like a lot of proto horror movie elements. And I would say, with regard to the question of perversion, the preface to the book that I read, as well as like kind of my own impression reading, is that the most perverted subjects in his novels are like these victims because they're routinely victimized and they opt to be victimized over and over again by virtue of like their faith. There's surely more to be said, but I'm certain we'll go over it once we start reading.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. I love the way that like if you read the dialogues of philosophy in the bedroom when they talk about anal sex, I'm sorry, but like there is a dimension of an eternally risque, like it even though we live in like what Beju calls pornographic society and shit like that today, if you read the dialogues of philosophy in the bedroom, they are super yeah, difficult to read because it's like this pure normalization of anal sex. It's quite remarkable actually, how it holds up. I don't know, Matan, if you had the same experience with the text you're referencing.
Yeah,
Does it feel like
I
very contemporary, maybe, if that's the right word? I don't know.
yes, and furthermore, I just happened to be reading about Pompeii. There's a lot of graffiti and like these crude crude engravings that were preserved there, and yeah, a lot of that is remaining.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, wonderful. And Andy, please.
Oh yeah, hi everybody. So I guess I'm coming to this text because, and thank you for having me in the group, by the way. I'm coming to this text right now because I'm working on a piece on Bataille, and his, specifically his work, Blue of Noon. I don't know if anybody's read this work. It's basically, he wrote it during the 1930s, like, well, fascism was rising, and I'm trying to give a reading of it. I'm basically trying to figure out, is Bataille a pervert? Because it seems as if, on the one hand, it seems pretty obvious that he is, but on the other hand, there is this way that, for example, Amy Hollywood reads him as performing what she calls a self-satirizing ironization of masochism. And I guess I'm just trying to think about how Bataille, perhaps Sade, try to draw a certain universal dimension to perversion. And I'm currently thinking about it in light of Laplanche's distinction between primary masochism and what he calls heteroaggression or non-sexual aggression. And I think that Bataille and Sade, and I haven't read this text in a while, so we'll see how it turns out, but perhaps Lacan is trying to get it, it's something of this universality of the primary masochistic urge. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Excellent. Matan, you had your a comment? It's nice to have you here. Thank you for sharing that reference to the Blue of Noon text.
Yeah,
Which
I just thought I'd chip in. I read Bataille's famous book, The Accursed Chair. And when he says accursed chair, to me that just spells, object A. And I think with regard to like your questioning of whether or not he was a pervert, I think more than anything, there's like a real commitment for him to defend the logicality of Stalinism, of to like take a specific position with regard to defending like show trials in particular and things like that and the excesses of that sort of thing. Although I wouldn't say it's like a complete defense, but it's rather more aligned with the project of like his own idea of, again, the accursed chair, the disavowed remainder, the trash somehow, or which is part of like the mortification process of alienation, somehow itself becoming like a vivifying force within culture. And precisely what vivifies the victims' bodies in the Sade.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I mean, I do think this accursed share, the remainder of Bataille, like, is something that he's trying to point out, like, this is like the illogical dimension of the, like, mass movements of the time that is disavowed on left and right in his view, right? And he tries to embody this through his own sort of meditative practice into the war, in which he like tries to interject this image of violence in a form of. This is why I'm considering whether whether you can count this sort of like radical form of meditation that he develops as a form of masochism, or something else, something which attempts to subvert masochism. And I hope that reading this text with everyone helps to elucidate that question that I have. So, but not to talk too long about Bataille. I know we're not focusing on that, but hope maybe I can contribute something from that direction as we move forward.
Oh, great. No doubt. And I think Caroline Dean's book that I mentioned before on Bataille, Lacan, and de Sade should come in perhaps very handy in answering that question as well. Okay. All right. Fabulous. Jonas, please.
Hey, can you hear me?
We can.
Cool. I guess I come to this text. Honestly, I just wanted to join the reading group again. And this is the book that came up, but I do have reason to be interested, I guess. Yeah, I like what Matilda was saying about like the law is like a function of language or something. Like there are always rules or something. How does the law actually manifest? And there's like the written law and the experience of the law, you know, like I'm thinking like an intersubjective. So maybe perversion is maybe it's like the marking of the law. I guess I thought that was neat. Or like the law, perversion performs an operation on the law is kind of how I was thinking about it. Like everyone knows what the law is, but the pervert kind of places it in a way. And I mean, if I suppose this could happen in a lot of ways. I mean, is Sade a pervert himself? Well, maybe in the sense that like he breaks the rules of like everyday sexuality and stuff like that. But if there's like the political perversion, like it's the pervert to the Kantian law as such, you know, that's like a different marking of the law. It doesn't matter that it was here or there, but that it was the acting out of Kant, you know? It's like a meta perversion. And yeah, and wouldn't that be what the revolution is trying to deal with? Like the revolution wants to mark the law. And so like for Sade, there's this kind of breach of like political revolution into the bedroom, you know? Or like how do we go from the law that is like political revolution to the law of kind of like the bedroom, the law of I don't know, sex and stuff like that. Why should that be though? Why should they be in like contact? So yeah, I guess I'm going through the idea of rupture. I've been reading about Bachelard lately anyway, so maybe the word's on my mind. But yeah, I guess that's where I'm at.
No, that's helpful. I mean, it does remind me at least of the debate that we broached in seminar 16 of Lacan, from another to the other, where you'll remember the conservative liberal Freudian school of Schmergel, who was very influential for Christopher Lasch, put forward the interpretation effectively that May 68 was concocting a kind of made an error, or the left made a kind of strategic error insofar as they idealized perversion as a means of addressing, in their view, in her view, a stunted, defective form of primary narcissism. In other words, perversion in her analysis, which is not a Lacanian analysis, is a failure, is a breakdown that occurs upon the unsatisfactory outcome that the revolt does not produce a blissful one. Right? So this effusion of the one does not occur. And in the wake of that, then the pervert sort of runs out of steam. And then, of course, in the introduction that Christopher Lasch wrote to her book on Wilhelm Reich and the left, right? He says that that's exactly what like the new left is trying to do, is fetishize perversion. And that this fundamentally creates a class barrier. And this is something that very much interests me today in some sense, especially after the legal case in the UK over the trans, that affected trans issues. So the question is sort of like, it's very difficult to answer this question, is sort of where are we at regarding the subversiveness or not of forms of perversion at a political level? Has perversion in some sense exhausted or saturated itself as a political strategy?
For sure. That's like the moment of politics today, is like, where is the law? I think we're kind of like in disorder on where the law is. You know, I mean, there's Trump's perversion, but then there's the left's maybe struggle to like define the law. I mean, the general law.
Well, exactly. No, in some sense, it's not so much that we struggle to define the law. It's that the pervert was subversive precisely because they were the ones who at some moment in the evolution of, in the historical moments of capitalism, could reveal what de Sade revealed to the Jacobins, as I was saying to you before. That itself has a shelf life. It has a so that's actually my question about politics and perversion today. Because if we take the Zizek'ian position, is it not his claim, and we can dispute it, of course, and we should, that we have a ubiquity of perversion, that in fact the perverse subject is like autoimmune, or sort of, you know what I'm saying? Like it's, so I'm raising a lot of questions here, but Luis.
Yeah, I would like to point out that disavowal, right, is first was denegation, right? And with denegation, what is clear is that, which is what the pervert does, right, is not only that it is negated, but you know very well the law, but you reject it, right? So it's different from, for example, schizophrenia. This schizophrenic or psychotic negates the paternal law, right? And for that we have these breakdowns, right? The pervert is within society, but within society, meaning also at the same time that he knows very well the law and somehow he's structured by the law, he rejects the law, right? So that's something different from psychosis.
Sanjay, please. Thank you for that, Luis.
Oh, okay. The theory on perversion that I subscribe to with regards to society, because I'm pretty sure that autoimmunity is something that's hysterical in nature, right? So there is this theory on perversion that says that right now, what is the perversion that is ubiquitous is what we call the borderline structure. But this guy proposed that it's this is a kind of perversion where we disavow the name of the father instead of disavowing castration. So I think like that makes a lot more sense about society, that people generally disavow the name of the father, because it's not really like Kantian or Sadean perversion, right?
I mean, what exactly do you mean by disavowing the name of the father exactly? How does that work for you in this sense?
So the castration has to do with the idea that the other is incomplete. So what classic perverts really care about is disavowing that the other, which is to say the woman, is different from a man. Like this is loyal to what Freud said about perversion, which is that people freak out that their mother does not have a penis, and then they try to disavow that. Whereas the disavowal of the name of the father is more like saying that, okay, so our current laws and our structures of meanings, that's just like a social construct, dude. We can totally just rewrite that and come up with our new structure of law. I think a good way of an example, I don't know how terminally online you are, but do you know about the effective altruists?
Yeah.
I would consider them to be a very classic case of disavowing the name of the father, because they are kind of saying that, okay, we have to like all of our current ways of charity, they are just based in meaning, based in sentiments, and they're like not reliable. We have to like go all the way to utility, which is the actual real thing, because meaning is the name of the father is that which grants us meaning through the symbolic, right? So that's like kind of the way that they disavow the entry into the symbolic, imaginary, whatever, and instead just pretend that they are addressing what is really there, but it's really just like the mental model of how things are characterized in order to put a number on a utility function. So this would be how I would talk about the disavowal of the name of the father, because I think it's like perverse, but it's not really the perversion that's like a disavowal of castration.
Okay, I now I follow. Now I follow. I
Yeah.
follow what you're saying. In other words, castration would be disavowed in the sense that it's a more of a primordial um, uh, kind of commitment to the notion of the like non-sexual relation or to the strong sexual difference or something like that. Whereas disavowal of name of the father is something that is more this kind of like postmodern position of relativism, perhaps, in which people can constantly say, no, that's not it. That's not what grants meaning or grants like some legitimacy to the social bond. I mean, that is an interesting point because, like there is this argument that capitalism, if you read
Mhm.
like the sociologist Eva Illouz, she has this
Yes.
incredible book called The End of Love. And it's very much related to what you're talking about in some sense,
Mm.
where she says self-worth for professionals, like middle class self-worth, is
Yes.
now founded off of the what she calls the epiphany of unloving, not based on like fusion, unity, or loving. But she says actually this is why she calls her she says that capitalism creates an ontology of cold relations.
Mm.
And this ontology of cold relations is based on well, she doesn't say it structurally as like it necessitates disavowal, but what she says basically is that uh, uh, modern relationships, romantic relationships, uh, are actually, and this kind of explains like trad culture in some sense, or it explains why trad culture is paradoxically perceived in our culture as subversive. Because what's not, that's the weird reversal, right?
Mm-hmm.
What has happened now in a weird paradoxical sense is that unbinding, unloving, and refusal, these kind of like perverse acts are now like what the system valorizes in a certain way, whereas binding, unifying, synthesizing is not valorizable,
Mhm.
right? And that I think explains a certain like baseline reversal of things since the like the 1960s till now, in my opinion. Anyways, I know we have other hands up and we haven't even started to read the text yet. Um, but I mean, I think this question of the name of the father and disavowal of it, my only hesitation with that, and Matan and Andrew and others can weigh in on it, I guess would be the question about like what actually is a name of the father? What does that mean? But maybe Matan, you can jump in and then Sanjay can respond.
Sure, I have an interesting contribution because, Sanjay's explanation and your response were pretty complex, but it manifested so clearly to me in the memory of like an actual symptom, so to speak, that I had as a child. It was a bit cruel, but I'll relate for you. In middle school, there in class we were making these presentations about social issues or whatever, and there was this girl who I had a crush on, but I also wanted to identify with my friends as being like not interested in girls yet or whatever. And so, she starts talking about like pit bulls and how they're just terrible things about them, how they're treated and so on. But then in the middle of it, one of my friends says a joke to the other and they kind of like lightly chuckle. And then I start like laughing to myself. And then suddenly the thought enters my head, and I'm so certain of this memory. Wouldn't it be really inappropriate if I just kept laughing right now? Wouldn't that be very absurd and funny? And so the idea of that got me to keep laughing and almost like bring it about as a self-fulfilling prophecy, all in the name of like avoiding my own like uh crudely menacing ways of drawing identifications and things like that.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you for that. Um, Jonas, please.
Honestly, I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry.
No worries. Andrew.
Yeah, I found that distinction of the difference between name of the father and castration a bit dubious because on the one hand they're consubstantial. So in a sense, like from what I understand, like the name of the father, which is the signifier, which is for Lacan both the signifier of signifiers, versus the mark of castration, which comes from the phallus, which is the function of the name of the father, which is supposed to be related to the phallus, which is the signifier of all signifieds. And in a sense, like, well, if there is a sort of distinction in the level of disavow, it's like I would say that the disavow happens on castration in the sense that, like, and maybe I misheard Sanjay's explanation, but it's like you disavow that you yourself are also marked by the field of castration. But it does raise a good point with Sanjay's thing because, and what your response was, Daniel, because it evokes again the problematic of what Lacan talks a little about, but does bring up about the fifth discourse, which is the capitalist discourse, because similarly, both the capitalist discourse and perversion aim at plugging demand. Um, and I believe I have the thing saved, so I could plug in the image of the capitalist discourse. But like if you look at it right here, so I posted right here in the chat, like the split subject is plugging in the S1 of jouissance as demand, and there is no social bond or arrow of discourse of a social bond to S2 or knowledge. And so capitalist discourse creates a figure eight. And in a sense, I feel like it gives rise to both things like at the one hand, what you see Malarians talk about with generalized foreclosure, and what the Slovenians will talk about as generalized disavowal. Um, I don't even know if we could really argue for both of them because I feel like that is sort of overmasking sort of a dialectical way of understanding society and history, which kind of falls into Lacanian ideology. But I will say, I think the capitalist discourse kind of points out something where like there is a plug of demand that kind of brings about a sort of disavow, in which, like you pointed out, like there's something subversive about these trends of evoking trad culture, because like in a way they think they're subverting something, but yet they're still falling in line with the capitalist logic. I know very well, but at the end of the day, right? And so there's the form of perverse disavow or
Right.
fetish disavow. So like you could still think that you're being subversive while at the same time conforming to the logic of the game, right?
Yeah, that's right. And
And I don't know if that is the distinction of the name of the Father versus, because at the end of the day, like the name of the Father is semblance, right?
yeah.
It's always been semblance. That's what Lacan has been saying since Seminar 18. And I think that creates a
Well,
crisis.
I think there's also a problem about invoking this concept of name of the Father when we're thinking about the application of these concepts to social and political realities or contexts, precisely because uh, there was this moment in the ethics seminar where Lacan put forward this idea of what he called the quilting between the symbolic, um, between the symbolic and the imaginary, in which the name of the Father functions as a hinge for something like meaning to be posited as
Right.
substantial.
Yeah. And I feel like
But then he abandons that. He abandons
Yeah.
that later in his teachings.
Yeah, I guess
So
that's why I'm so like interested about like this distinction is because I think this is where like Lacan will bring up the matter of the fact of like the inversion of Dostoevsky's if God doesn't exist then all is permitted, where he's like, no, if God does not exist then nothing is permitted, and this is why like the other and even the signifier which would complete the other,
yeah,
which would be the name of the Father, it's the signifier that represents the desire of
right.
the Mother, is meant to instantiate some type of other who enjoys or some type of other that marks prohibition, but also permissivity, some a
Mm.
field of permission. And
Mhm.
so I think that's exactly what the pervert is at the deadlock of with desire, right?
Well, not only that, but also Lacan's whole conception of name of the Father becomes um like it's not to be understood as an existent social form that we latch onto or not. That's not how it's to be understood. It's to be understood in his later clinic as something that each subject invents. Each subject invents. Yeah. So it's not the biological father on the one hand, and nor is it like some social form that is like valorizable or pre-valorizable or sort of ideal. It's not an ideal. It's not a typological. It's not a social type, right? Um, yeah. It's and moreover, its function is about, in a very interesting way, I think, clinically, overcoming a certain impasse of desire. It allows that. That's why it's initially connected to this question about metaphor, right? In psychosis. Now, of course, the pervert has a very particular relationship to name of the Father, but that's separate. Okay, Sanjay, please. Oh, okay, sorry. Akshay, please.
Wait.
Oh no, I
But
thought you took your hand down. Do you have a
oh no,
comment?
no. I just forgot to unmute. Yeah. Um so the book is titled A World Without Limits. So he posited that um the role of the name of the Father is to set limits, to draw boundaries between what is, I mean, that is what meaning is, right? Just like drawn boundaries. And so the difference between, I think there is a meaningful difference between the kind of borderline perversion and perversion, which is that say, you know how Zizek said that the cop is structurally perverse? Because the cop is like acting out the law as like the instrument of the law. But what is given as an example for borderline perversion is more like consumerism, where you just enjoy more and more with no limits, or addiction, where the archetypal relationship here is more like you're suckling on your mother's breast. So you just like keep taking more and more and more without the name of the father going in and saying, okay, that's enough. You have to stop. We're not allowed to do this. Whereas castration is more like realizing that, oh, okay, there's like a fundamental impossibility of relation between me and my partner, between me and my mother, I guess.
I see what you mean. Yeah, that's helpful.
I hope so.
Yeah. No. That I think the distinction now makes a lot more sense. And then now that you reference that book, that also makes sense, because yes, I write about this in my book on the family as well. This importance of the structure of capitalism in a post 68 configuration as one in which the subject is faced with symptoms based on the like fact that they don't have instruments available to impose limits. This is the famous idea of the overwhelming enjoyment or surplus jouissance and the pressures that surplus enjoyment puts on us. And so, yeah, you could call Name of the Father as an instrument for managing that issue, you know? I think that's valid for sure. Akshay, please. We can't hear you. Can you guys hear? No. Okay. Yeah, we cannot hear you, Akshay. You may, I mean, you're not muted, but there may be an audio issue. Maybe you could chat a point. Let's go to Jonas very quickly, and then we'll go back to Akshay.
I only have a quick comment, so
Please.
hopefully, yeah. So we were talking about like the name of the father, but it's sort of like which one? There's not the name of the father. It's not like, I mean, maybe back to what I was saying earlier about like the law as such. Is there like a metaphysics of the law, or are there only these instances of the name of the father? You know, you could never, it doesn't stick around as, or that there's the issue maybe of like social replication of the law, you know, which one, I guess, you know, like there's this uncertainty of where the law is placed. It's not like this on top of everything is this guiding law that is asserted, but there's like a point that something has to be taken to be the marker of the law. Anyway, that was just
right. No, well,
the
that's
distinction
true. I
between
mean,
metaphysics and like the everyday life kind of thing.
no, that's true. I mean, in the seminar on the psychoses, Lacan refers to Name of the Father as the introduction of a primordial signifier, which was foreclosed for President Schreber. And that was the cause of the foreclosure of that primordial signifier, which then left a void in his imaginary, which kept him in a state of psychosis and therefore of supreme suffering.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But Lacan will pluralize this idea and experiment that names of the father are plural and all of that, and that modifies over time. But still, even though it modifies over time, it only does so insofar as what he's now talking about is the names of the father in all three registers of the RSI. Whereas originally it was about the imaginary, like how the names of the father emerges as a bridge between symbolic and imaginary. I think once we introduce the real, you have this question of the body and enjoyment and stuff like that. So it changes up a bit. I gave a presentation on this where I get way into it. It's one of those concepts that the Malarians have done a lot of good work around, frankly, names of the father, especially clinically, in my opinion.
Okay, I'll check that out.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Okay. Well, look, guys, should we start reading, or I actually do have to break at 7:30. I don't know what you guys' time is like. Do you guys want to like wait to read next week and like call it just like this is like our chatting session? Is that okay?
I'm down with that.
Good for me.
Is that chill? Okay. And then we can come and then let's do some more reading and maybe say a few more things about the general background. So let's try to read the Adorno Horkheimer piece as well. It's not that long. I put it in the Discord. And maybe even the Caroline Dean text. I mean, as much as you guys can, you know. And then, of course, read Philosophy in the Bedroom itself, or also listen to it in the wonderful YouTube thing I sent, which is quite good, actually. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Andrew.
I was gonna say I'm trying to find a PDF of it, but if any of y'all have read the Reading Seminars 1 and 2 commentary text edited by Miller and Fink, there is an actually published lecture from Miller on reading Kant, avec, Sade, where Zizek is like the main interlocutor, and it's really a great exegesis on Kant, avec, Sade. I'll try to find it on PDF for y'all, but if you have the physical text, I would recommend reading that because that was really helpful. He breaks down the relationship or the non-rapport between Kant and Sade.
Yeah.
Best Miller I've read.
It reminds me of this wonderful essay by Bruno Bostiels. And what was it? It was Zizek without Beju. So it's like a play on the title. But it's a close, like a methodical. It's a very methodical piece, actually. I can send it to you. Where he tries to sort of, because like speaking of Zizek, I know there's many people that read a lot of Zizek in our group right now. I felt like Zizek was so much more containable when he was in proximity to Beju, because so much of his work was actually like a direct response to Beju's project. And now that like Beju's work is not as talked about as much anymore, it's less clear. I can send this essay by Bruno. It's quite interesting, actually.
I really think young Zizek was a lot better than compared to now, to be honest. And especially when he was under analysis with Miller, he wrote a lot better. Because Miller was his analyst, right?
I agree with that 100%. 100%.
What's the timeline for that, if you don't mind me asking?
Timeline for what?
For like when he wrote, I mean, for his split with Badu as well as with Miller, I guess, as an Elisand.
Okay, well, the split with Miller occurs.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No. I mean, I think I have a general answer for this. I mean, I think, because we've asked him about this. And there was some very specific political things that occurred. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. Well, what I do know is that a lot of it was actually on Miller's side, and it was not so much. I'm trying to remember. There was a certain breakdown. Like Miller went hard right wing, liberal right. At a certain point, it was pre-pandemic for sure, but it was not. I'm trying to think if it was like the war on terror period. There was like some kind of like latent Islamophobic aspects to it, I believe.
Well, also even prior to that, there was that like incident where like in the sort of cartel that he had, the Malarians were trying to criticize Zizek and saying that everything that he was trying to do as a sort of theoretical criticism to Malher was an effective transference. So they were trying to psychoanalyze Zizek's own theoretical criticisms of Malher. And Malher didn't say anything about it, as if he was sort of in cahoots with their sort of rebuttal.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, there was also that.
There's also that. Yeah, that's true. And now, as it pertains to his split with Alain Badiou, I mean, it's not so much that there was a strong split. There was definitely a series of disagreements. What I was really referring to is that when Badiou was at his most productive is when Badiou was at his most productive is when Zizek was at his most productive. Because he's kind of aping him, he's kind of building off of what his work was. Say, for example, in the Logics of Worlds period was the height of both of their productivity, in my opinion. It's when you had their works on love, you had their mutual interest in St. Paul, you had basically go and read the tribute that Badiou wrote in Logics of Worlds appendix to Zizek to get a better idea of it. It's pretty apparent. And even when I witnessed them in cahoots with each other, this was also when they were organizing the idea of communism conferences, which were pretty significant in their own way in terms of their attendance and interest overall. In some sense, that was like one of the last moments in which you had like the master European intellectual kind of figures going around. I don't know. But I don't think that they have like that they are arch enemies. I think that they had sort of mild disagreements over certain things, but the main reason that it's kind of waned is because Badiou's no longer as productive, even though I think I told you guys he accepted our invitation to speak in China. But now we can't hear from him because he does this. He accepts, but he doesn't follow through. So we're hopeful that maybe he will, but we're not sure. Either way, the conference is set for November. And what we may do is actually have like him filmed maybe in Paris. It's hard to say. So is that okay? Is that a letdown? Do you guys wish to read the text, or is it okay if we bounce?
I want to comment something else. Also, I think that this the split between Badiou and Zizek is also, I think, relevant to Shupangshi's intervention, how she becomes stronger, right, with introducing sex, right, and the sexual difference, which leads Zizek to a different direction from which Badiou that cannot follow him, right, and then also everything about quantum mechanics. So yeah, they completely set apart.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. There's a whole thing there. I mean, I think also, yeah, you're right. Like Badiou dignifies Zizek's communist and Marxist commitments because his commitments were, I think, much more sound. So he really improved Zizek's work. And Malaire did too. I mean, Andrew's right. Like Malaire also had a certain. I mean, it's very interesting though, yeah, because like you have Leclau break, you have Malaire break, you have Badiou slight break, but kind of whatever. And maybe Slavoj needs like a new interlocutor that he doesn't have.
Right. Right. Because Parallax View was his explicit break with Leclau and Move. Right. Yeah. I mean, prior to that, but like he explicitly writes that he broke from them by critiquing them in the beginning of Parallax View. Whereas in Sublime Object, he's very adherent to the Leclau thesis.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I know I heard some cheese man. Apparently Leclau is a dick. Like he at a conference he yelled at Karatani for just talking over the time limit, and he said, "You're done." And Karatani was like so shy and scared. I was like, "What the heck? Like that's mean."
Wow. Wow. That is crazy. I mean, imagine if we could get Karatani to join one of our activities, that would be something.
Yeah, as long as he's still alive, we need to get him. Yeah, that guy's a gem.
Okay. All right, comrades. Well, so is there anything you want to say before we break regarding the Trump Sade paper, or would it be better to broach that once we dive into the text, Luis?
I don't know if you have any comments. Yeah, I don't know. Also, how we're gonna do next week, because I think Andrew is also presenting his paper.
Andrew's sending his paper. So my comments on the paper, very briefly, and then we can open it to others. Because I mean, I thought that it worked out well. I would just only recommend a couple of slight. I would only recommend like a couple slight changes to it, honestly, which is more of a question about. There's a few descriptions that you explain concepts, but you don't reference or make a citation on the one hand, but also I think that, and I can send you like comments and footnotes or whatever. Even though it's very lucid, and I think you should be praised for how lucid you wrote it, you also, I think, at certain moments, assume that the reader may know more than they do about certain things. So I would have liked to see some further elaboration, which I think you're very capable of doing, but it would just require kind of expanding on the certain things, being a little bit more didactic. I am a fan of being more didactic when it comes to Lacanian concepts, even though it may seem pandering or it may seem like whatever, but that's actually the kind of service that you should do to the reader. Because if you really assume, if you really assume the reader has no knowledge of this material, then you would actually have to elaborate quite a lot more.
Yeah. But sometimes I don't know what the other one doesn't know. So, but anyways, I didn't have the time. But yeah, because I wanted to add some, of course, citations and everything. Yeah, but as you can see, it doesn't have citations because I was really rushing. But yeah, that's true. And but that's in general, I think that's as an issue of my side, that, well, precisely because I don't know what the other person doesn't know either. So, but yeah, but that's true.
No, I mean, I thought you made a good point about the treatment of the bureaucrats, and how Trump is treating them in a certain way, but also there's also a series of ambiguities about it, because on the one hand, it's not like, that's the funny thing with Trump, is that I could never think of Trump as a Kantian figure, because he's not a universalist figure at all. One can see how he may appear that way, but he's a figure of, like, I mean, in terms of ethics wise, don't you make him out to be a pragmatist more so?
Well, I also think, because I think that for Lacan, Sade is not a universalist either, right? Precisely because he rejects the law. If he were to accept the law and therefore castration, he will be a universalist, right? But on the contrary, he doesn't, right? And then his maxims cannot be universalized. If they were to be universalized, it will take a different position, right? And the same for Trump, right? If he's loyal to make a great again, of course, that's a thing. Like, how can we understand that? How make America great again? Some people understand that, say, okay, you make a country great again, America great again. You can make your own country from elsewhere great again, right? But of course, that's not how Trump understands logic, right? And this is how I think, in the same sense of Sade, doesn't allow his heroes to reciprocate. And this is how Lacan understands the death penalty, that Sade at the end doesn't accept the death penalty, meaning that there cannot be reciprocity for his crimes, right? In that sense, he refuses universality. So I think, yes, of course, Trump, like Sade, are not universalists, right? And precisely because they reject the law, right? They know very well the law, and then yet nonetheless reject it, right?
I guess the point, though, is that yes, it may be a rejection of universalism apropos castration, but is it not in ethics, in the key of the imperative, in the form of the imperative? And again,
like, for example, let's see.
I don't see that happening with Trump.
I mean, let's see the tariffs. Like, I mean, we can see the tariffs as an example exactly that if okay, he can be an idiot, complete idiot, knowing that he's hurting the economy. But I mean, the example of tariffs, like this is one of the critiques of the right wing against all left wing movements, right? That every time the left wing movement take power, they use tariffs, right? And this is at least in Latin America how they will implement this critique, saying, "Oh, becomes a left-wing politician, he will use tariffs or use the state to control the economy, right?" And knowing that they will hurt the economy on the short term at least, right? And this is what Trump did. So in that sense, yes, there is this imperative that goes against the pleasure principle, right? So, of which of course he's. I mean, of course I'm elevating Trump to an ethical figure, but there is a sense in which he completely disregards any superficial sense of pleasure, but of course he's not completely able to commit to it, right? So that's the thing.
Yeah. No, that's actually quite that is more convincing, yes. No,
But
I
yeah,
think
I couldn't
you're definitely
elaborate
onto
that to make
something.
it more sense in that side. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be my only comment is if you could do that. But again, that's my preference. Some people may disagree with that. Any other comments on Luis's piece?
I still need to read it just because I've been so busy over here. Even though I'm on vacation, it's not been a vacation. We've been really busy. But I will say that yeah, I do plan on presenting my paper next week, but I want to keep it at least like 20, no more than 20 to 30 minutes because I want to read this text on Kant, avec, Sade. But yeah, I would like to present as I promised. I would like to present on the 22nd? That's the date, right? Which it's incomplete, but there is a central thesis and it relies on 2 citations, Seminar 16 and Milner's work, Freudian slip, Milner's work on Lacan and science. So I would definitely love to hear your all's thoughts and maybe even be more didactic as Daniel said regarding like supposing the reader's knowledge. So yeah.
Okay, great. Matilda, did you want to jump in?
Sorry, my head was bobbing, but I did want to I had just a question about Luis's paper, and I feel like I'm confused over like for the rejection of castration or like transgression and how that's thought in like Lacan. I'm just generally confused about that. Yeah.
In what in particular? Like, what is confusing about castration?
I was thinking about I suppose, well, I don't know, like the difference between like just violating the law and the rejection of castration, or are those the same thing? Is violating the customs the same thing or different than the rejection of castration? And I suppose that's like throwing off prohibitions and like customs as kind of related to prohibitions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also, for example, for Freud, right, there is the idea of the superego is first conceived as something internal, right, and then in the civilization, this content is understood as some external entity that imposes, their laws, right. And I think that they both need to be understood together, right? Because in some sense, the name of the father, of course, relates not only to then the father saying no, but a whole set of rules and norms from which this symbolic order has certain prohibitions, right? from which, of course, Freud understands the superego to be this external agent that imposes certain rules, right? But other than that, internally, right? For example, in the case of Kant, for Kant, there is a difference between rights and duties, right? Because for Kant, a right is something that is external. So you should follow the law, and nonetheless, of course, an ideal society that has certain laws and everything, right? So there is still some prohibitions that are external, but then a duty is something that you yourselves submit to, right? And of course, this is how Freud understands also the superego as being some internalization of the law, right? So, so to the question of the name of the father, right? It relates to the to all this set of rules that at the same time function like in castration to set a limit, right? So in linguistically also, right, the signifier sets a limit and generates desire with it, right? So I think what is in what the focus of the issue is desire, and how castration relates to desire, and how the pervert has a mechanism to contain the desire of the other, right? So the disavowal of castration is a way also to contain desire, the desire of the other, of this excess of the other, right? That cannot be contained. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, that it's helpful or something else.
It makes sense. I just need to keep thinking about that.
Louis, I really like, because like it makes me think from personal experience, just like living in like back in California, like, you know, it's surprising like how people like in other states in the US like see California as like completely liberal, or they call us California. When like there are so many like conservative towns. And it's interesting to you know, thinking about your essay in the title and what you explained, because it's like at one point like we had exposed all the flaws and holes in Trump himself, not only as a person but even like as a signifier that sustains. But it seems like with Trumpkins and people that live MAGA, it's like as if there is a perverse tendency to kind of like fill in the gaps of Trump themselves. Like there's this sort of instrumentalization of MAGA, or what, like, you know, Trump represents in this instance of like actualizing that more than Trump would himself.
In what sense do you see the difference? Like,
well,
MAGA more perverted than Trump? Is that what you're trying to say?
I feel like there's like, not to say that maybe like they're more perverted, but it seems like perversion actualizes itself not just in Trump, but like in the way that the people, like the coalitions or masses that like of people that, you know, uphold MAGA seem to sustain the faith more than Trump at times.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, and I don't know if you've been to America a handful of times or like currently, but like, I mean, it's surprising in California how many, you know, MAGA groups there are, and towns. Like I'm thinking of, like, for instance, a town in northern San Diego called Santee, but they have a history of a lot of white supremacy and conservatism. They used to be called Clan T back in the 60s because of the KKK. But you see a lot of MAGA like not protests, but like people just holding up like signs like, you know, pro-Trump, stop abortion, and all these other things, and, you know, like whatever signifiers they want to put on their you know, poster boards. But like the thing is like, in the way that they're so convinced, it almost seems like they even try to like go beyond Trump while sustaining, you know, the fantasy or enacting, you know, and the scapegoating, you know.
Yeah, I mean, something to add. Yeah, that's very interesting to relate to the other and the reciprocity between the two of them.
Yeah.
There was something else.
I was just gonna say, like, and it's interesting in Southern California because we're so close to the border. how those sort of politics play out, you know, and enact themselves in the public daily life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but at the same time, I think that I mean, Trump as a figure rejects precisely the figure of mastery of the master, right? As we have understood what is a master in Seminar 17, right? And in that sense, there is almost no difference between the followers and him, because he himself rejects the position of the classical politician, right? And he himself, in that sense, he himself is a believer of the deep state, right? So, and because he, like the rest of them, believe that there is a deep state, in that sense, I think, yes, they follow the same cult, because I think what they believe more than Trump himself, they believe that there is a deep state even behind Trump, right? So the other of the other, meaning the other of Trump, is that deep state, right? So in that sense, and that's what I think Lacan sees Sade as being even more Christian than the Christians themselves, right? He believes in God more than anyone else, right?
You know what's so freaking funny is like during the election when they were like doing the debates and stuff like that, I was working at this in El Cajon, so it's like there's a lot of it's predominantly Hispanic. And so like I was working at this healthcare center, and I walked into the break room and the TV was on because they were doing the debates, and they had the news on a Mexican news channel, and they were actually showing like something from, I want to say it was from Peru. There were some curanderos that were doing a ritual, and they were smearing like blood to like hex Kamala's like image while also putting like some type of like herbs and all that around Trump. And I'm like, why would, first of all, why would Peruvians care about American election, first of all? And then why is it these sort of curanderos, these shamans that are doing a ritual for the sake of Trump? You know, like, and it begs the question, like, what type of not only politics Trump spreads around globally, but also the type of people in other sorts of continents or countries that would be associated with that type of line of thinking. It's like, shamans are supposed to be on the periphery where they wouldn't care about politics, but it's like, you know, I don't know, there was just something so interesting about that symbolic gesture. Shamans cursing Kamala on an image with like, you know, blood or whatever. Like, it was so fascinating. It was only something that you could see on like a Mexican like news anchor. Like, it wasn't American TV at all. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. There's many shams that are very like sophist, like they go anywhere,
Have you
like
guys
any positions.
have you guys ever noticed that like Donald Trump's function is not fulfillable as such in the sense of a classical authority figure who can make possible some promise or deliver. No, like where Donald Trump is most essential for, like, you know, these subjects that desire some type of tradition, like you're talking about the Peruvian ultra religious or whatever have you, is precisely the fact that he's this liminal figure that's almost like a figure able to reveal or the hollowness of existing liberal power. But that doesn't presuppose, or that doesn't like, that the consequence of that does not mean that Donald Trump also is like able to be king, you know, in the sense that say my family as Trump supporters, you know, I really noticed something very interesting, which is like because if they really did think that he also could be a king, then they would actually be critical of the fact that he's like failing with his economic vision and stuff like that. I don't even think that that's actually what the identification with Trump is about. Yeah, I think the identification with Trump is about something more basically destructive in a certain way. You know, it's more about that. That's where the satisfaction comes in as something incomplete. He's not a figure that is able to like promise, I don't know, like, but like maybe that's what makes Trump actually like if you like a not an Oedipal president. You know that idea that like the last Oedipal president was Richard Nixon, you know? I don't think Trump is like that. I think he's definitely like a post-Oedipal president. I don't know if you guys agree. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
He's just like a figure that sort of allows destruction. He's that's also why I think he's the figure that allows the enjoyment of revenge to be enacted. You know, but he doesn't. He's not a figure of success or a figure that people would trust to reset the balance or synthesize something or bring about a new world order. That's the funny thing, is I don't think his supporters are stupid enough to really believe that that's what he wants. And because if they were, then they would be let down that he's not. But they're not let down because that's not what they want from him.
It's almost like does Trump act like a sort of screen memory for some type of play out of enjoyment of fantasy or revenge then?
Yeah. I think that's much more like it.
yeah, that's why I point out how he formulates this idea. They're laughing at us, but we were a laughing stock. They were laughing at the U.S., but they're not laughing anymore, right?
Mm.
In this sense that, as you said, is this injunction for revenge, right, against these liberal elites, right? And I see that in relationship to Sade again, how Lacan understands that what the injunction of Sade was to destroy the moral goodness of his victims, right? Or, I mean, the characters, right? The victims, right? In the same sense that I think all this MAGA has the goal of destroying, of course, the moral good, but the liberal consensus, as Lacan understands as the good, right, as being the pleasure, being understood as these pleasurable rules, right, that determine social world, right, and this is what I think Sade and Trump are moved and driven towards destroying this set of rules, right? More than constructing something else, right? A completely nihilistic injunction.
Right, but with I think with Trump, there's like a bit of there's still a failure going on to completely go through with that, because there's, for instance, when he got shot got shot at, there was really this whole undercurrent of like mythicness or something like that, or kind of like superstition that he's somehow chosen. So if he might not be the master of anything, but by virtue of that, he is somehow the master of his fate, and he certainly at times believes this, or he says he does. Especially, I mean, I've noticed, have you ever heard him talking about the weave? Anybody heard him?
No.
Oh, he he has this ongoing commentary on his own like rhetorical method. And it's basically just, I don't know what I'm saying. I basically don't have control of my body. I'm just giving things a nudge here and there, and it's just working out okay. And that seems to be it entirely. And it's interesting to compare that to Kant, who maintained empty formalism through this sort of like repetition, this habituation. I've never fully understood why commentators like to talk about. They repeat that about him a lot. But the more I read them doing that, the more I think that there is something to that.
No,
Yeah.
that I definitely agree with, and I've actually tried to write an article about how the historical origin of that is in the luck of the aristocracy, right? Because there's something also about the discrimination. I mean, there's a very like American ideological operation going on there, which is even related to Musk. How is Musk the one who's permitted to oversee the destruction of the American bureaucracy? Is it not because he is a figure of pure luck of the market? Like, in other words, is there not something like almost like divine, maybe, about his status as subject which of course Donald Trump also shares.
Yeah,
So
of course.
I don't know. There's that. There's also this like Gnosticism theory of Harold Bloom that I'm curious about. You know, his argument about in the American religion text about Gnosticism would almost have to be like updated vis-a-vis like a Marxist analysis of like the Gnosticism of the billionaire as like a pure figure of like the Midas touch, pure figure. You know what I'm saying? Like that figure, and then you could even relate that to castration, because in some sense, is Trump and Musk not also exempt from castration in a certain way, at least from the vantage point of their followers? So I mean, I'm just fully freestyling here, but I'm very
no. If anything, I feel like the people who exempt them the most from castration is not even their followers. Although to some degree, I agree, but the ones who do that the most, I would say, are like liberals and Democrats, especially. And I think this is like concentrated in the abundance equation. I mean, it's absurd to me with regard to like Elon Musk. It was precisely like the overinvestment into like an unthought field of hopeful future gains, I suppose, with tech and so on. I mean, there's an entire history of California where he's received hundreds of millions, billions of dollars for doing absolutely nothing, for filling out forms, and the abundance mindset is essentially to do try the same exact thing without any new kind of like executive decision making capability. VCs, venture capital, have grown more influential. The ability of the army to intervene and subject these kinds of technologies to that sort of oversight no longer exists.
But it's not about him though. It's not about him. It's a whole logic of fetishism, because why was Le Pen legally barred from running against Macron? Did you see that? You saw that, right? It's not the fetishization of these right populist figures takes on like a certain continuity. There's a certain continuity there. The same in Brazil. It's the same in Hungary. It's the same in France, right? Whereby the liberal imputes. Like I was talking to a friend, and he told me that Ram Dass was a deeply political figure, and that surprised me. You know, Ram Dass, the famous New Age guru, and he was political, but his politics were liberal fetishism. For example, in his room, he had one poster, apparently, and it was of Robert McNamara. And so he thought that the locus of American imperialism was embodied in one man. That's the kind of liberal fetishism I think we're dealing with. You know?
Daniel, that is so funny that you said Ram Dass, because I don't know if you watched all of the conversation I had with C. Derek Varn, but we mentioned those spiritual dudes that how, you know, if there is a merit to Rock Hill's CIA, you know, iceberg tip, that, you know, Ram Dass, what is it, the Terrence McKenna dude, were actually tied with that, and we're going to universities. And even though they were trying to preach sort of this sort of spiritual like revolt through consciousness raising, in not even the political sense, but spiritual sense, there was a sort of deeply reactionary political tip with that. So that's so interesting that you raised that point.
Yeah, I mean, it's related to the argument that I've had with the platypus people as well, because it's about this idea of fetishism ultimately, which is kind of like very related to Desade's, because again, Desade's argument is basically that we need to invent new fetishes. We need to invent new fetishistic. That's ultimately what makes him kind of like a philosopher, right? He's basically saying, and if you read Kolakowski's book, the name escapes me right now, but that's also what he's on about, right?
It's called Sade, My Neighbor.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, yes, exactly. So it's like that, right? It's like in some sense, it's very like Plato based, like the Republic. Yeah, or well, for Klosowski, Klosowski, it's Augustinian. So he thinks that like Saint Augustine created this like finite world of kind of points of fetishistic investment, but then the Christianity, right, is like this symbolic force that blocks like a proper libidinal investment in those fetish objects, right? And that's kind of what de Sade is trying to undo. He's trying to radically undo. So he sees Christianity in everything. And that's ultimately why, like, it's like part of my hang up with Nietzsche. You know, it's like I don't see Christianity in the same way.
Right. And I feel like that's interesting with this criticism of Christianity, because at one point, like, well, if you see, like, for Hegel, he's like says that like it's what Christianity was allowed to do that Roman law couldn't do was the personal relationship. Like, even though there was a sort of personae in Roman law, it was only imbued through property relations. Where like in Christianity, there is this private relation that is more intimate and also more abstract. So the notion of an individual becomes more abstract in the sense than even Roman law could give.
Yeah.
And I think like what you when you were explaining like Sade's sort of fetishism of the pagan and even the mystery cult, it's as if like in that sense, even the sense of individuality that is supposed to sublate the faults and foibles of Christianity maintain this almost elitism that's almost similar to the Pascalian Jansenism, in which only a few are given revelation from God, and in
Right.
sense only the few can be given the right to ascend the mystery cult of Eros or of Venus or whatever pagan god you want to do. So like in a sense, the other as mystery and the veil is still contained, right? And you could still fetishize it even if
Yeah.
initiated, that there's something that is worthy of invoking one's own individuality as they exercise and are worthy of initiation and subject themselves. You have to be subjected to the mystery, which I think, you know, is quite different from, you know, when you actually articulate Christianity from the non-Nietzschean Sadean criticism. Like, for instance, I mentioned Hegel, and even in the sense, maybe we could even say Marx is still indebted to some type of rational kernel to Christianity in its communalism or universalism.
Yeah, no, 100%. Because I think one of the interesting things Klosowski does also is he has a long analysis of Fourier, the famous utopian socialist, and he compares de Sade's community to Fourier's community in his book. The other one, not the neighbor one. That's a very interesting comparison that we could study at some point in the future, because he has this whole idea of what he calls the phantasm, and it's like this like whole complex theory of like libido, and it's very interesting. But although, man, I don't know, like I was recently in Rome and I was struck by how sad in a way it made me that Christianity took over the pagan thing. Like, you know, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but
How Christianity took
it
so
made me a
many things
little
from
like
pagans.
curious about what pagan spirituality was actually like, because Christianity took it over so fully, so absolutely, you know, it left nothing. I don't know.
I'd like to mention something about de Sade, who like the whole like connection with Nietzsche, kind of those like antichrist figures. It is kind of a romantic trope to be like the atheist, and it does seem like perhaps there's a relationship with like liberal democracy and atheism versus like the feudal Christian predecessor. And like there are different notions of like where the law comes from. I guess I'm thinking of like how maybe like liberal democracy could erase like the master signifiers or something. In the sense that they kind of disavow that, like I've been reading Carl Schmitt and like I'm just thinking about like how they thought the law was founded. They kind of disavow like the sovereign in a certain way and think that like the law doesn't depend upon the sovereign. And the prior period was like the law, like the intervention of like the sovereign kind of like gave the law or whatever. I don't know, just thinking about
Yeah.
and like that would characterize de Sade as a romantic according to Carl Schmitt. Like he has this whole thing about romanticism as a political movement that kind of like ends in this like infinite like aesthetic relationship with the world that I don't know, kind of loses itself in its homogeneity or something.
I mean, and the other stuff I think is the contrary, how with, of course, the MAGA supporters see the prohibitions with political correctness, right? And in some sense, I think they're correct to see that there is an multiplication of prohibitions with political correctness, right? But at the same time, I don't think liberals believe in political correctness as much as MAGA supporters do, right? And
What do you mean by that?
Well, I do think, for example, I have heard many MAGA supporters saying that, oh, they are indoctrinating the children to act in that way, when in fact that is not how reality works, right? Of course that's an illusion, a fantasy of MAGA supporters, right? And that they're taking their right and everything, right? And they actually believe more than liberals do in those prohibitions, right? And in fact of the weight of the prohibition, right?
Yeah.
Because in a sense, yes, I mean, liberal society is regulatory, right? It is not based on as like in a Lacanian ethics, right? It's much more utilitarian and regulatory.
Yeah, no, that's the theft of enjoyment thesis as the backbone of Mega. I think we always lose track of that, but it's still very central to the whole thing, which again, I mean, I feel like you would have to make a distinction between like a movement of ressentiment, which I think what Trumpism really is, right? Which would make him Bonapartist, in the classical Marxist distinction, not Caesarist. Because again, the desire of the Trump movement, I think the desire of the Trump movement is actually not a desire. Like Samo Tomsik gave that lecture a few years ago to our group, where he said it's like all driven off of negative social affects and resentment. That's much more accurate, in my opinion. I think the real question would be, maybe you could say that is what doesn't make it fascist. Maybe that fact alone, perhaps. But anyways, guys, I have to go. Can we break right now?
Yeah,
Sure.
I gotta.
Is that
I
good?
have to go to sleep.
Oh yeah. Okay. All the best. Until next time.
Bye.
Is there anything we want to say about the text in general before we jump in? I know we've been doing a lot of reading. I want Akshay to come. I know that Akshay is deeply engaged with all of this material. Let's find out. I'm just going to send a quick message.
Yeah, I got a copy of the Marquis de Sade Philosophy in the Bedroom. It's quite interesting, like in the manner. Like I don't know if anybody's read it. I think you said you did, right, Daniel? Like
Yeah, I've been reading it recently. I mean, my
that.
main focus, and we also need to talk about your text, obviously, as well. Andrew,
Mhm.
that's a focus of ours today as well. But my main focus, I think, is what Lacan is focusing on, which is the kind of political manifesto. What is
Yeah.
it, Matilda, chapter 4? What is the
It's
chapter?
in chapter 5.
5? Yeah.
Yeah.
Of the text, right?
Onward,
Yeah.
Frenchman. Yeah, okay, actually, it's here. Excellent. I think we can begin now. Yeah. So, Andrew, let's open up with a conversation on your text. Maybe you could start by telling us what you are seeking to achieve with this text.
Yeah, I think like the main thing, because I think like in the beginning thesis of the intro, like I was trying to kind of make the whole thing of the absolutization of the market the sort of focal point for not only thinking Lacan's political situation in this seminar and engaging with Marxism, but also topology and how his use of topology can show like the process of the subject within the market and science where like there's a hole in the other, right? As he says, which the other is truth and knowledge is of course aligned with that little a. And so how we see this process between jouissance and the field of truth as the other shift towards the market, right? Um, it's almost like the way I kind of imagine it is like as if like there is the death of God, so like we need to find a new field to replace it. And it's mostly for science, like science um, needs a new sort of other, and so it finds a cleavage within the absolutization of the market. That's why I kind of like put in that thing like a perverse marriage between the discourse of science and capitalism. So I think like yeah, I think like a sort of some feedback would be like um maybe some nuances, maybe the aspect of Marxism that could be lacking in that essay that could be helpful.
My first thought is that these 4 points should be revised into the form of um,
Yeah.
conflicting theses or statements that are not like merely declarative, but
Hmm.
they need to you need to try to demonstrate some interrelationship between them.
Yeah.
On the one hand, like because I think this piece would benefit from a central thesis statement. Otherwise, I mean, because I think you have a lot of disparate points that are very compelling. It's almost as if you have selected uh, the most essential points regarding epistemology and science from Lacan
Hmm.
and sort of sought to um, make them plain, so
Yeah.
to speak. And that's
Yeah.
good. That's
Yeah.
very nice. But that's not a thesis. Like that's not like a. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Okay. I see
Right?
what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That and oh, just go ahead, Luis.
No, but I was going to say that I was going to also reiterate that point, right? That I found many interesting points, but at the end, I was like, okay, what is the goal of this essay, right? So I reread it, and of course, there is no clear thesis, right? So
Right.
what I was thinking at the beginning is, okay, are you trying to find what is the goal again? Yeah, what is the goal to find the gap, right? In these readings, or to explain, do an exegetical work, right? So, but again, this will be clear with a thesis that
Yeah.
states
Yeah.
in one or two sentences where you aiming to to convey with this essay, right? So yeah, as Daniel says, you could synthesize all this into to one thing, right? That I don't know how many pages are you aiming to write, but it should be simple.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good thing. I didn't like, yeah, the kind of confusion between the 4 points and the thesis. Yeah, yeah, it's not the same. But yeah, I don't think I made the thesis clear enough. So that's yeah, I think that's
I think
something
you can make a right now it's like notes on Lacan's theory of science.
Mhm,
What you could derive is something about this exegetical point of how it changes from one period of his thought to the next.
mhm.
That may be most in line with the thesis that you want to develop for a paper like
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Probably within these notes, you can add more notes and then develop it in a richer way to then, because that's kind of what you're trying to do is, as I see it, right, is make an account regarding how Lacan's position on truth in science evolves,
Mhm.
internal to his thought. Now you have Milner's uh, theory of these different stages of Lacan's thought there, and you can articulate those.
Yeah.
Probably your best bet would be, you know, if you dig into your work with Lorenzo Chiesa's work on all of that,
Mhm.
combined with Milner, maybe you could find an interesting point of contrast
Yeah, yeah,
between the two.
yeah,
Hmm? And
yeah.
then identify that. But here's the key point. That still is not a thesis,
Mhm. Yeah,
right?
because ultimately I just get up lost in exegesis, but I do care about the exegetical point, but I don't want to get lost too much with like, sacrificing the thesis,
You can make a clarification regarding the status of a difference in the secondary literature. That
Right.
itself is powerful for the purpose of a paper,
Hmm.
right? Um, but first you have to identify that difference between these two fields. So I would try to systematize your notes maybe more in
Hmm.
regard to Milner and these other interpretations of Lacan's theory of science that you work with,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, in order to dig down into something. Uh, yeah, because I think your objective would be to separate yourself from these secondary literature interlocutors.
Hmm.
But the only way to do that would be to clearly be able to distinguish between them.
Yeah.
I had a few thoughts. I wanted to, I enjoy all the topics and find them all very interesting and hope that they get fleshed out. I I was interested in, I don't know much about kind of this theme of like, kind of like an Athens and Jerusalem theme that I noticed, like when you're talking about Courier's and Koyeve's and Lacan's kind of like seeing like Courier's thesis as like a special case of Koyeve's. It does, I mean, does sound something like an Athens and Jerusalem type of theme, and I was curious to have more like citations on that because I haven't really encountered. I suppose like it, I wasn't exactly sure like where in Lacan's text to like pick up on those themes, so I just was curious like where those were identified.
Yeah, I should put the citations on there, like the footnotes, but yeah, that is directly from Milner's first chapter on the core doctrine.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. And then of course there's like it does seem like there's like the question of like Lacan's turn with structuralism and like seminar 14 kind of being like a turning point. And it does seem like maybe I thought like there like your third point at the top of your paper about the no there's no universe of discourse. Maybe like this idea of a lack of closure. I was wondering if that was related to like closure, like seems to be identified as something ideological or something, and like maybe like fleshing out the ideas of like the two different unities that we read about in Althusser, like the Hegelian unity and like the structuralist unity, could be useful, perhaps. And And I just found it like an interesting idea, and I'm curious what Jameson has more to say about closure. And there's, yeah, I guess there's I have some more thoughts. Maybe I'll like send you a
Yeah,
message.
I think I read this as like a teaching document, or like, kind of like it's both notes, but it's also a way for you to deliver like a kind of presentation on the material itself, right? That itself is quite valuable. I think also there are some sentences that you may want to go back and reread from the position not of, because like that's the challenge I think of editing yourself, is the capacity to step outside of your voice. And so if you read certain sentences as a standalone and ask yourself, does this cohere? Is this actually sensible? Um, and then drive yourself to elaborate more until it is, you then will generate 3 or 4 sentences from one incomplete sentence, right? And then you have doubled your length of your work just by doing that, right? And I would even moreover reference Tupanamba and Dennis Yao. They did this incredible thing. You may be familiar with it. It's this huge PDF, hundreds of pages. It's a collection of notes on every single text from Lacan. Remember that one?
No, I don't think I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, it's a nice strategy for note taking on Lacan. I'll share it with you in a moment. Um,
Please.
and your text reminds me of that. It's somewhere between a didactic note document and a teaching document, right? Like something that you could use as formalized notes for uh, a lecture, you know? And I would actually say, as an exercise to improve your writing, go back and read each sentence and then rewrite it from the rhetorical position as if you were speaking it. And then once you do that, the clarity will improve. It doesn't matter if it's informal. I mean, you already have some informalities here, but you also have a lot of rigid sentences that could get broken apart if you exert that discipline on yourself. Do you know what I mean? So I would try to do it that way. If I have the time, I can also go in and like track change specific sentences to show you what I mean in terms of elaboration. Right? I would just simply say, like, in each sentence you have 3 or 4 ideas. In some cases they merit their own sentence or two.
Hmm.
It's more about that, like you could think about it kind of like massaging and opening of the stuff, right?
Right.
And I think even in that, you will then unravel your thesis as you do that. Sorry, yeah, go ahead, actually, please.
No, just on this writing point and about the purpose of this paper, like, I mean, I don't know. I personally, at least, I think there's a difference between like Brunry's kind of writing, right? The research notebooks writing and the capital, right? Like once you, and like, I don't know. I mean, this doesn't strike me as odd at all for a document where you're working out your own thoughts. And like, it's kind of, I mean, it's a very helpful exercise just to like write it out and see it and, do all of the editing work that Daniel talked about. And I mean, like not having a thesis is fine. That's part of the research process. Like it kind of, yeah. I mean, I just wanted to throw that out there as like, um, yeah.
Right. I think honestly, I think was it Daniel, you might have kind of brought clarity on what my thesis might be when you said in passing uh uh the question concerning epistemology, but also Lacan's notion of science and truth changes throughout his um
Yeah.
teaching. I think that might be a sort of maybe not like say, okay, that is my thesis, but something to kind of help me massage and unravel those things because I never thought of it like that. But in a sense, yeah, that's kind of what I'm aiming at, but also looking at how psychoanalysis, I guess, operates within the sort of crisis within the other, with the absolutization of the market, from the position of Seminar 16. And I gotta like remind everybody, like this was actually like a trio paper because this was just one part. Eleanor had her own part, but now that and our other friend, now that we're not doing this, this was for a presentation on philosophical research and psychology. I feel like now I could do more to it, now that it's not like restricted to a certain panel, and it could be something that could generate a thesis, even if it's along the lines of a teaching exercise or putting all my notes into something, you know?
Yeah, it's a certain matter of discipline because
Yeah.
the example of Tupanamba and Dennis was very rigorous in terms of their commitment, which is probably something we should do as well. But unfortunately, I've adopted like a way too much of a individual orientation to my writing. But what they did, just so we're clear, is that they read every single Lacan seminar. They shared their notes. They then edited the shared notes as one document. But then they did something really nice after that, was that they wrote a book um, based on an interpretation of what they read. It was really, really rigorous stuff. But they spent like, God, like 6 years doing that. And it was a very weird time for them because they were caught in this like 60s anonymity thing. Like their journal was called Silicet, which was like an anonymous journal. And they were just like caught in this like Žižekian revision of Lenin's theory of the vanguard as an anonymous collective. Really strange, but pretty brilliant stuff, frankly. I'm trying to pull it up here.
In the meantime,
Yes.
um, yeah, something to be very precise, because I think you have a thesis. The problem is that a thesis is not very clear to what, like the link of the introduction that is about the absolutization of the market, and then what the body of the paper is about. Like there is not a clear link of what for, because what appears to be the thesis is my presentation will illustrate the following with regards to this last talk about the theme in Lacanian studies as they are crucial for psychoanalytic theory and the perverse marriage of science and capitalism as it raises a problem with the subject and the author, right? But then what is that relevant to the absolutation of the market, right? And that's what is, this link is not clear to the next points that are the substance of your body, right? And I think that's the issue with the thesis, that is not clear. Maybe it could be also a good idea to continue bringing up examples of how is that relevant to the absolutation of the market, so you can have a system that goes around this central idea of the absolutation of the market, right? And not just bring in points that are somehow not interconnected, right? So maybe a good way to connect all these points is to go back to the essence of what you were thinking at the beginning, is about the absolutization of the market, right? So yeah, I think that's you lost track maybe of what you were trying to say at the beginning, and maybe to go back. I don't know when you start writing it, right? As Daniel said, maybe you can leave it there, and because sometimes when I write some stuff and then I read it after some months, I completely like read and say what I was writing about, right? Like I completely don't understand myself, right? And sometimes you have it in your head right now and it's completely clear, but then later it will not be, right? And this is probably how someone else will read you, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. Shall we start the text? Or Andrew, did you have any other further thoughts or questions for us?
No. That was really helpful. I think Luis's last point was brilliant about the link, right? I think that was like a big thing too, because yeah, as going back to it, I realized it was kind of like a gap. Like, how do I bridge all that together? And even I think like, yeah, rethinking those 4 points and combining them maybe into like one, right? But also to kind of over the main point is like, generating that thesis, right? Because I got to think about what was I think Luis brought up a good point. What was I thinking at the time of writing this? Like what was in the back of my mind?
Yeah. Okay, I found this crazy fucking document. It's fucking Mad Men. Oh my God. They are so modest too. Huh. Okay, I'm going to share this with you. Actually, you know what? I'll just download it and then. Okay. All right, cool. Matana, are you all ready?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to offer, I mean, I'll read, of course, I enjoy doing it, but if anyone else wants to, if not, I'll do it. Anyone feels inside themselves that they have what it takes to read and to enjoy themselves while doing it freely, then please pipe up. Okay,
You are the one.
yes.
Hold on 1 second. This is 730 pages, by the way. I'm gonna post it in the Discord, just as an FYI. Now, would you like me to share the PDF on the screen while we read? Is that preferable?
I got the Écrits right here, so whatever suits you and my fellow cohorts here.
Um,
Yeah, I got my own copy of the Écrits right here, so I'm fine.
okay. Yeah, I'm inclined to not share it then. Okay. Please.
Yep.
Please, everyone, just jump in. This if we can take it as slow as possible.
Okay, so yeah.
What page were we on though? Does anyone remember?
We're about to start it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. We didn't start. Okay, fair.
We were, yeah, if you recall, we just had an interesting, maybe not so interesting conversation last time. Anyways, let's start. Kant with Sade. This essay was to have served as a preface to Philosophy in the Bedroom. It was published in the journal Critique as a review of the edition of Sade's works, for which it was intended, the 15-volume set brought out in 1963 by Editions du Cercle du Livre Précieux. And I'll just add that this whole thing with that it was initially supposed to serve as a preface for something else. I was reading Danny Nobis's book about Kant with Sade, and he gets into this, and he also gets into what Akshay and Luis were arguing about with regards to the Sade's perversion, and he has like a kind of a straight whatever. He goes into that right in the beginning of the book. I don't want to hold up everything here. I'll just begin. The notion that Sade's work anticipated Freud's, if nothing else, as a catalog of the perversions, is a stupidity repeated in works of literary criticism, the blame for which goes, as usual, to the specialists. I, on the contrary, maintain that the Sadean bedroom is of the same stature as those places from which the schools of ancient philosophy borrowed their names, Academy, Lyceum, and Stoa. I see myself and some others are in the room right now, or in their bedroom. Here as there, one paves the way for science by rectifying one's ethical position. In this respect, Sade did indeed begin the groundwork that was to progress for 100 years in the depths of taste in order for Freud's path to be passable. Add to that another 60 years before one could say why. If Freud was able to enunciate his pleasure principle without even having to worry about indicating what distinguishes it from the function of pleasure in traditional ethics, without risking that it be understood, exotericized, by echoing a bias uncontested for 2,000 years, as reminiscent of the attractive notion that a creature is preordained for its good and of the psychology inscribed in different myths of benevolence, we can only credit this to the insinuating rise in the 19th century of the theme of delight in evil, bonheur dans le mal. Sade represents here the first step of a subversion of which Kant, as piquant as this may seem in light of the coldness of the man himself, represents the turning point, something that has never been pointed out as such, to the best of my knowledge. Philosophy in the Bedroom came 8 years after the Critique of Practical Reason. If, after showing that the former is consistent with the Critique of Practical Reason, I can demonstrate that the former completes the latter. I shall be able to claim that it yields the truth of the critique. As a result, the postulates with which the critique concludes, the alibi of immortality in the name of which it suppresses progress, holiness, and even love, everything satisfying that could come from the law, and its need for a will to which the object that the law concerns is intelligible, losing even the lifeless support of the function of utility to which Kant confined them, reduce the work to its subversive core. This explains the incredible exaltation that anyone not prepared by academic piety feels upon reading it, a reaction that will not be spoiled by my having explained it, it being the critique. One might say that the shift involved in the notion that it feels good to do evil, or if you will, that the eternal feminine does not elevate us, was made on the basis of a philological remark, namely, that the idea that had been accepted up until then, which is that it feels good to do good, is based on a homonymy not found in Germany. Man tut sich wohl im Guten. The good is the tasteful, although I came up with another translation. The good is an unaffected sensibility. This is how Kant introduces us to his critique of practical reason. And so I see that Luis has a hand up. I'll call on you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in a way, we should maybe stop far more often than before, because this text is very compact, right? So already there are so many stuff there, right? Like at the beginning, for example, of course, Lacan is claiming that Sade's bedroom is that of a place of the academy, right? And I think that's clear. And what he's pointing out is that with Sade, thanks to Sade, Freud's work could be possible, right? He's opening the way for analysis of these practices that go beyond normative behaviors, right? And how, in a way, this starts with Kant himself, right? Which is something counterintuitive, right? That for that same reason, the critique of practical reason is completed by Sade, right? So that's a very strong statement, right? I don't know if someone else has something to say about that.
I think it's interesting that that it completes it, but he also says that it's consistent with the critique of practical reason. So it's consistent with that which it completes. So the completion has to be somehow superfluous, but also pivotal for the identity of practical reason.
Okay, yeah.
Or yeah.
No, those are great points. I mean, a couple additional points. One is in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which I think is the clear reference. You'll remember this status of evil is mentioned. In what sense? Through the articulation of what Freud calls sadistic drive. So death drive also is referred to at times as sadistic drive. Sabina Spellerin, who really initiated the discovery of the sadistic drive, I think referred to it that way. So that's one point. I think the other point regarding the discarding of de Sade as a sort of perverse flaneur or bohemian is interesting, because he's trying to respond to this climate of censorship in France that was happening around Marquis de Sade at the time, which was really propelling the whole return to de Sade, right? And an interest in, I think, sort of revisiting his biography. And I think that, Akshay said a lot of interesting things in the Discord about that. Also, some of the things we've read about de Sade from secondary literature standpoint interest me around, precisely around this fact that his subtlety is not born from some kind of narcissistic desire to be ludic for the sake of it, but is born from like persecution and imprisonment and direct suffering, you know, as a way out of that in a certain way. Um, so that's one thing. I think the other thing that's important to note apropos Kant and practical reason is this question that Horkheimer and Adorno introduce us to, which is precisely the question of the Marquis de Sade finishing Kant, from their point of view, finishing Kant's What is Enlightenment? Because he discovers something about heteronomy. Yeah, like this reliance on the radical reliance on self is reliance on others as well. That immediately seems very odd because how because if you know anything about the Kantian system of ethics, it's about purity. It's about expunging empiricism completely. Um, and so how can the De Sade also possess that kind of rationalist um yeah, movement away from the empirical is a big question, I think, especially given that he's like so caught within the throngs of direct suffering. Please, actually.
Oh, like I'm not sure he's like that he has these desires and then he's imprisoned and like that's why he writes this. But it's like it is a bit more categorical, right? Like he could have not gotten in trouble, but he sort of chose to. I mean, I think it's connected to this kind of like in what way does Sade complete Kant or like and I mean, I guess it's interesting because it's not the claim that, oh, Kant is like secretly a sadist, right? But it's kind of that, uh, I mean, I guess at some point I feel like there's a reference to like, um, in Kant, something about the ambivalence of this situation is sort of like covered over, right? Like, and I guess like what you see with Sade is like, I don't know. I'm sorry, I forgot what my actual conclusion was.
No, it's
But
good. No, it's good. I
um,
think it's something also about the failure of utilitarianism to adequately account for like the status of Christian ethics. Because keep in mind also, when you read philosophy in the bedroom, it's a fucking intense polemic against Christianity. We can never. Uh, it's like a elaborate theory about the repressive, like desexualization of Christianity on the radicalism of the Republican tradition. The Republican tradition is being um, abused by Christian moralism, and he's constantly making an appeal to the need for Republicans to have better virtues. So yeah, sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, no, that's a good point to really clarify about the polemics against Christianity because one of the things that Saint Ange, one of the main characters in the philosophy of the bedroom, is like fantasizing about Dolmans, right? As her brother Chevalier is talking about him, and she's just like, "Oh, I just hope he's not a Christian." Out of all the things that he's listed as far as like pleasures and acts, like the only sort of red flag is that he might be a Christian. But I think it's interesting thinking about the truth of Kant, like Sade was like the truth of Kant or like completion of Kant, because not only bringing up the whole thing about the what is enlightenment, but also like the purpose of education, right? And for Kant, like not only is enlightenment something that makes us, I'm paraphrasing it, overcome our own immaturity, but also this question of like of education to overcome like man's brute mentality or whatever language he uses. I know Zizek talks about it in the Freedom book, but it's kind of interesting thinking of it like in that sense, the purpose of education. Um, because education is the biggest thing that seems to be going on in these dialogues with Saint
Yeah.
Anne and you what is it? What's her name? The young girl, Eugene, I think it is. And how like she doesn't want to sleep with that like promiscuous man, but as soon as like she starts to kiss Saint Anne starts to kiss on him, then she starts to mimic. So it's like the way in which like the bedroom also acts as a scene as like again the academy, the lyceum, the stoa, in which like the other like properly shows like the practices and techniques in a sort of philosophical way. Because one of the things about like this dialogue is like not just the acts but the sort of knowledge behind them, it seems like. Um with that being said, one of the things I wanted to bring up is like it makes sense then why Lacan will say that in Seminar 8 that the analytic cell is nothing but a bed for lovemaking. So like there is like in a way in which Freud was able to bring up the analytic act, right? This interesting thing of like how love binds society together, but somehow there's also this sort of concealment and privatization of our desire
Mm.
that is constantly repeating in the bedroom, but then simultaneously in the analytic act laying on the couch, there's something made public that was once private in a sort of different dimension compared to the Sadian thing. But my last point was like when you brought up the sadistic drive and evil, this is also interesting because then right after he writes the essay on the economic problem of masochism, right?
Mm.
In which like if we were truly masochistic then we would just destroy ourselves, but yet there's something embedded within the economy of that drive of the primary masochism that destroys ourselves but we still keep on going. So I think there's something to add to that as well.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful, Andrew. Thank you very much. I'm gonna feel, oh yeah, Luis, just one moment. I'm trying to bring up my notes from Beyond the Pleasure Principle because I do remember towards the end, when we studied it many years ago, there was a reference to Kant and something like regulative ideal at work here because we're about to jump into the technical parts of the text. One question I had is what is the translation that you're reading from Baton? What's the name of the translator?
It's the one by Bruce Fink.
Ah, shit. Okay, I'm reading a different one. I like the Fink one better than the one that I'm working with. Let me see if I can find it. Go ahead, Luis.
So yeah, to go to the more detailed aspects, right? So Kant is referring to the postulates of the critique of practical reason. And yeah, he doesn't explain much, but this is very crucial, right? I don't remember if he mentions that again. So in the postulates of practical reason, Kant claims that so first he starts to compare his ethical doctrine to that of Aristotle and classical Greeks, right? And the Stoics, for which happiness, you can, if you do good, you will reach happiness, right? And for Kant, that's a problem, right? Because how can virtue be grounded on happiness, right? In that sense, for him, happiness can only be obtained, let's say, in the afterlife, right? And in that sense, he claims that given to these presuppositions to act morally, we need to presuppose one that there must be God as the entity that judges our actions, and there must be an immortal soul, right, that strives for perfection, for moral perfection, and there must be freedom, right? So you can choose to do good and to on the moral law, right? So what is interesting here, why he mentions that, is that this, of course, immortal soul, in its striving for perfection, follows that follows a certain masochistic drive, right? It's always criticizing itself, always not being holy, right? And that's kind of the hinge here of why he mentions the critique, right, and the postulates of reason.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's extremely helpful for background into the Kantian. Motan, could you share the PDF of your translation in Discord very quickly? Or if you can share it over here.
Yeah,
directly.
unfortunately, I'm reading from a physical edition. But if one of you maybe want to look on Libgen really quickly while I'm reading, maybe it's on there. Or in his archive, whichever.
Yeah, no worries. Please.
Yep, I'll pick
Please-
up right.
Please continue. It's fine.
As a result, the postulates with which the critique concludes the alibi, immortality, in the name of which it suppresses progress, holiness, and even love, everything satisfying that could come from the law.
Put the link for the Écrits edition in the chat. Sorry.
Yep.
Oh, you found it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep. In the alibi of immortality, in the name of which it suppresses progress, holiness, and even love, and its need for a will to which the object that the law concerns is even intelligible, losing even the lifeless support of the function of utility to which Kant confined them, reduce the work to its subversive core. This explains the incredible exaltation that anyone not prepared by academic piety feels upon reading it, a reaction that will not be spoiled by my having explained it. Now, one might say that the shift involved in the notion that it feels good to do evil, or if you will, that you know what, I'm realizing that I read this, hold on. Yeah, so, okay, I'll pick up the quest to feel good further down the page, would thus be a dead end were it not reborn in the form of the good, das Gut, the good that is the object of the moral law. Experience tells us that we make ourselves hear commandments inside of ourselves, the imperative nature of which is presented as categorical, in other words, unconditional. Note that this good is assumed to be the good only if it presents itself, as I just said, in spite of all objects that would place conditions upon it. That is, only if it opposes any and every uncertain good that these objects might bring one according to some theoretical equivalence, such that it impresses us as superior owing to its universal value. I'll just pause for a second because I think this is important. So this is like outlining a method for the supreme good as being essentially coincidental with the most evil, precisely by virtue of its method being so pure that no matter what content it receives, it will spit out like a machine the good. Yeah. Thus, the weight of the good appears only by excluding everything the subject may suffer from due to his interest in an object, whether drive or feeling, what Kant designates for that reason as pathological. We would thus find anew here the sovereign good of the Greeks by induction from this effect, if Kant, as is his wont, did not specify once more that this good does not act as a counterweight, but rather, so to speak, as an anti-weight. That is, as subtracting weight from the pride, the proper love, the subject experiences, or pardon me, the love of propriety, the subject experiences as contentment in his pleasures, insofar as the look at this good renders these pleasures less respectable. This is both precisely what the text says and quite suggestive. Let us consider the paradox that it is at the very moment at which the subject no longer has any object before him that he encounters a law that has no other phenomenon than something that is already signifying. The latter is obtained from a voice in conscience, which, articulating in the form of a maxim in conscience, proposes the order of a purely practical reason or will there. For this maxim to constitute a law, it is necessary and sufficient that, being put to the test of such reason, the maxim may be considered universal as far as logic is concerned. This does not mean, let us recall what logic entails, that it forces itself on everyone, but rather that it is valid in every case, or better stated, that it is not valid in any case if it is not valid in every case. But this test, which must be based on pure, though practical reason, can only be passed by maxims of the type that allows for analytic deduction. This type is illustrated by the faithfulness required in returning a deposit. We can get some shut-eye after making a deposit, knowing that the depositary must remain blind to any condition that would oppose this faithfulness. In other words, there is no deposit without a depositary worthy of his task. one can sense the need for a more synthetic foundation, even in such an obvious case. At the risk of some irreverence, let me, in turn, illustrate the flaw in it with a maxim by Father Yubu that I have modified slightly. Long live Poland, for if there were no Poland, there would be no Poles. Let no one, out of some slowness of wit or emotivity, doubt my attachment to a freedom without which the people mourn. But while the analytic explanation of it here is irrefutable, its indefectibility is tempered by the observation that the Poles have always been known for their remarkable resistance to the eclipses of Poland, and even to the lamentation that ensued. We encounter here anew what led Kant to express his regret that no intuition offers up a phenomenal object, in the experience of the moral law. I agree. Oh, by the way, it's interesting that that coincides with how I've heard Badiou talk about the object of history and so on. But I agree that this object slips away throughout the critique, but it can be surmised in the trace left by the implacable or the implacable suite Kant provides to demonstrate its slipping away, from which the work derives an eroticism that is no doubt innocent, but perceptible logically, the well-foundedness of which I shall show through the nature of the said object.
Okay, so a couple of things we might want to say here. So, one, we have introduced this idea that one finds an unconditional reverence for the moral law through the voice of the law itself, and that moral law itself is purged and purified from all pathological dynamics of the world. So, like a good example that Lukács constantly critiques in Kantian ethics is this idea that you can have a Kantian ethics that is literally unconcerned about the empiricism of a changing situation, right? It's like it's what's called a priorism, right? And so there is this sense of a subtraction from really like time and place in a certain way, right? And there is therefore this like sacredness that the subject takes upon themselves when they are maximizing the moral law. And the best essay, if you haven't read Kant to really, that I always teach on this, is Groundwork for the Metaphysics of All Morals, where all of this is really, really elaborated quite well. It's kind of like a good, I think, appendage to the Critique of Practical Reason. Yeah, so it's this duty based, right? Everything in Kant is about the purification of a proper form of duty to act in obedience and reverence for the law, but you kind of get around the idea of it being coercive, right? Because it's connected to what Kant will claim is an unconditional good, right? And that I think is why Lacan is rightly saying that Kant is bringing ethics from the Greek notion of sovereign good, like back into the modern, for the modern subject in some sense, right? I don't know how much folks have a reference or a familiarity with the ABCs of Kantian ethics of the categorical imperative itself. I don't know if is this familiar to people or not? A little?
Yeah,
Andrew?
I've personally read Zizek's commentary of Hegel's commentary on Kant's categories of
Oh,
assertoric
really?
reasoning or whatever. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
but more than anything, I think just the experience of seeing people try to like pass off rigor as knowledge and then kind of facing the consequences for that in real life kind of cements this idea in my head.
I don't follow. What do you mean exactly?
Well, you know what? I don't know. I was reading this and just to bring things into contemporary politics, I remember Elon Musk during like 2013 when he was kind of focusing on getting his companies to perform or to demonstrate some kind of desirable potential for productive, I don't know, whatever. And he just had these episodes where he would sort of I don't know if you heard about like Mr. Beast. Like so much of I feel like Silicon Valley and like the history of how that's become what it is and how the figures have gotten their sort of power is just through these really kind of like childish demonstrations of like doing challenges that are just purely it's like watch me count to 1,000,000 or something while spinning with my head, and it feels like that's essentially these sorts of demonstrations that were staged within these companies. Anyways,
I see what you're saying though. Like,
yeah,
just because you have a rigor to demonstrate like a practical reason or like something like that doesn't mean it's knowledge of something.
yeah, you know what? Yeah,
Yeah.
method and the content that that method is approaching.
Yeah, I mean, part of this with Kant is that you do have a continuation of something like, and this is a debate, because there's a question about the relationship between Kant's form of ethics, which is called deontology, and virtue ethics, right? In the sense that what ultimately is going on with the Kantian subject is a purification of the will of the human through proper adherence and abidance to the moral law, right? Like that act of willing it, the categorical imperative over and over improves me as a human being, right? But what Kant lacks is a theory of that self-improvement of ethics of the human being that's grounded in a natural or social context. You see, that's the key point. That's why Adorno, in his lectures on ethics, can accuse Kant of a certain complicity with Nazism, insofar as the general, but insofar as the Nazi general can give orders subtracted from situational contexts, right? And then it mirrors the Kantian notion of duty, right? So there's this ideological operation that has becomes a profound danger. Yeah. So there's like a lot to be said about this. The other point, of course, is the thing of subject and object you have at work in Kant's ethics as well. Um, Insofar as what's unique about Kantian ethics is that it's only rational beings that can share in common this maximization of a moral law, right? So it's like, in a certain way, one can see the enchantment and the romance that a student would have with learning about this Kantian world because it's very subtracted from the world itself, right? In a certain way, it's like a perfect space. You know what I mean? Like,
Isn't there also a relationship between Kant in his later years and Rousseau with the social contract?
no. Kant breaks from the Rousseauian social contract.
Hmm.
But in a way sort of wishes to absorb some elements of it in I've written about this in the forthcoming Flowers for Marx essay, actually, because you kind of get into this in the What is Enlightenment essay as well. But Kantianism is not social contract theory. Kantianism is its own thing, right? It's a very unique system. It's an extremely unique system. The idea that you can take this notion of a priori truth and apply it to ethics in this way is bonkers, really. Luis, go ahead.
Yeah, talking about Rousseau, right? Because I mean, Kant was not aiming to write neither the second critique neither the third critique. When he wrote the first critique, he thought that he was done, right? And then he writes the Meal of Rousseau, and that changed his life. And that made him be interested in ethics and by the groundworks and the second critique, right? Because in Emile, we have, which is very similar to Sade, right? We have the case of education, how to educate children, right? In the case, and in the way that Rousseau explains how to educate children is to allow the children to come out to hear to their own reason, right?
Yeah.
And with their own reason to find the moral law. And this is how Lacan comes to the idea that the moral law is within us, right? But already in the first critique, there is the idea of freedom. And this is part of the antinomies. The third antinomy is about the possibility of freedom, right? And freedom for Kant is some unconditional causation, right? Something that is not caused by something else, right? And this is, of course, how is that possible? And therefore, cannot really be proof, right? But it can only be proof in practical reason, therefore, right? So this is the idea of freedom that somehow is not moved by anything else. Therefore, if it's not moved by anything else, it cannot be moved by sensible causations. That's why Kant needs to reject the fact that there could be a sensible causation, like you're hungry or you want sexual pleasure, right, as being the cause of your decisions, right? And in the second critique, it is because freedom must be grounded on your own reason that the categorical imperative needs you to come up with the maxim. If you are not the author of the maxim, then this is not a categorical imperative, right? And that's why, in a way, this critique of Adorno somehow and Hannah Arendt too, right? Forget the fact that you need to come up with this idea, right? But of course, right, there is the ideological aspect, and that we cannot forget, right? But what is interesting for Kant is nonetheless that you need to come up with this maxim, right? It doesn't need to be influenced by someone else, by images or examples, right? And you need to be submitted to that. And that's why the categorical imperative is based on a maxim that everyone else could follow. And this is how Lacan understands that, because what Lacan is saying that the good, which he claims just to be good, that is a union between the good and what is pleasurable, right, cannot be a source at the end. It cannot be the inclination, right? And therefore there is a problem for Kant. It cannot be a phenomenon that causes you to act correctly, right? At the end, it is the voice of conscience, right? What moves you, and then what later he will explain with that Sade reveals, right? But it's not clear to me is exactly this case of how he makes the categorical imperative into analytic deduction of the depository. That's still very unclear to me. I don't know if someone else has a clear mind about what he means by deposit, and the depositor needs to be faithful, and like that's not clear to me.
You mean that Lacan references this word depository?
Yeah, when he talks about analytic deduction, right, and this paragraph about the deposits, making a deposit, knowing that the depository must remain blind to any condition that will oppose this faithfulness. How is that related to analytic deduction? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the exact reference here. So it's right on, what's the pagination or the page?
There's a page we were reading, is 647. That's exactly in the middle of that page.
Okay, thank you. Please, Akshay, jump in. Oh, I got it now.
I mean, I agree like very thoroughly like with Luis, like where like I mean I was following along this discussion about like I don't think Kant isn't being practical, right? Like I mean I think it's not quite a priorism as much as like the difference between what's categorical and what's like consequential, right? Like and sort of I mean both what Luis was just saying about the kind of like intense subjective individualism of this, right, which is the beginning of the subversion in Kant of this kind of modern subjective notion of the good that isn't virtuous and harmonic, and that anyway, I mean, so there's that, but it's also this comment about the Poles in Poland, I thought was the kind of the concrete manifestation of this, right? Like kind of the Poles say, oh, we can't live without Poland. But in fact, we know Poland has not existed. The Poles have nonetheless subsisted, right? Like, and I think that has to do with like what is categorical and what is like, I mean, what is, I mean,
Yeah.
there has to be some operation of transcendence by which something is, becomes the master signifier of the good for this field, right? Like, I think is sort of the claim, right, made, like, because if you're adopting a consequential logic, you're like, I will do X if Y happens, right? Like, and you calculate infinitely in a kind of like utilitarian calculus, right? Like, Kant's kind of point of insistence would be that no, there has to be a point at which you don't calculate, right? Like, or you can't calculate. Like, this vision of like infinite calculation, it like lacks kind of this a priori that would ground it, that would give it as kind of categorical, the good. But I mean, again, it's deeply modern in the sense that the only way that you can arrive at the good is through this subjective interpolation, right? Like as rising to the moral law.
Yeah. I think this analytic deduction point has to do with the idea in Kant, in Kantian ethics, that there still does have to be ethical choices made, and one has to make a determination whether one's ethical choice conforms to universal laws or not, right? So that would, I think, be the deductive logic that's required for proper ethical action, so that ethical action adheres to the kingdom of ends. Like
I
that's
mean, there's
constantly
a
being
focus
posited.
on universalization, but I don't think that's the important focus here. I think the focus here is on the categorical nature of the choice, right? Like, uh, so why is the decision arrived at, like in its internal structure, right? Like, did it come from the outside or the inside? Like, to put it kind of like vulgarly, right? Like, um, but I don't know. I mean, maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, sorry, I'll just add there has to be like an element that is like a ledger that is constantly being made to kind of like legislate the boundaries between the inside and the outside, I would say. And I think like I don't know if any of you see this in his uh outline of Kant's distinction between the pathological and the or whatever, the logical, the withdrawn, the unaffected. I definitely get a sense of the distinction Marx draws between exchange value and and use value, and the fact that there needs to be a universal equivalent of exchange, which is a use value, which nevertheless facilitates the implicit reality of all the other use values as being ultimately decided in a system based off their relation to each other in this symbolically undifferentiated or underivable formula, or whatever. And sorry, and I think it's that like precise logic which engenders this sort of like faith that I think you see with regard to like the depository. With the notion that there are like, or there we know for a fact that there are like industries that we view as pivotal. I keep making that mistake for the like economy or something that have nothing to do with that have to do with maintaining the sense of trust, essentially, or at least nominally. And that's how they kind of like leverage themselves in terms of public opinion, in terms of their own estimation of themselves. I mean, Milton Friedman, and this goes into Hutt's recent discussion with that Marxist, I forget her name. His ultimate like imperative, I could say, or he would say to the government was always, I don't know if you would read him. This is so obscene. His ultimate like goal was just to get more economists like him. He says they need more people like me in the government in order to fix things. But anyway, sorry for that.
Yeah,
Yes.
but I think the thing also here is the point about the poles is a reference to the Kantian conception of the human as pure sites of dignity, i.e., the Kantian human is all that matters for ethics, and it is that which is incalculable. Right. So it's kind of like that on the one hand, but I think on the other hand, here's the other point, right? Is that Lacan's trying to make something about this notion of deposit having to do with the theory of the object. And I think how the death drive is also like there's some kind of depositing in the act of purifying one's will in relationship to the reverence of the moral law and being a good Kantian subject. There's like a surplus, there's like a deposit. Something like that is my premonition. Go ahead, Jonas.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I'm not sure which version you have, but mine, there's a note in the at the end of the word that line on deposit. It says, see comment on theorem 3 of the first chapter of the Analytic of Pure Practical Reason. So I assume there's something that Kant said that Lacan is referring to with the word deposit.
Yeah, let's look that up.
Says. Just thought I'd comment on that.
Yeah,
but,
thank you. What is the exact reference to the text from Kant?
I don't know. I don't know that. I was just noting that.
Somebody, no, I'm saying somebody should look. Somebody can look it up.
Well, what I was going to say is that I mean, this idea of the deposit, I was thinking of it more like the
what section of the critique did it say? Does I have it right here?
Analytic of Pure Practical Reason, first chapter, theorem 3. So that's just the Fink version. I'm sure if you have the whatever. This is one of the footnotes. Anyway, the deposit, I was thinking of it more like the spirit is a bone kind of thing. Something has to contain the universal.
No, it is right. It's about sorry, I'll hold your thought.
Sure.
It's that the universal law must have form over content. Again, it's about the necessity of the willing to expunge the pathological, to expunge the empirical, and to not regard content material. So it's a distinction that he's drawing between form and content. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. So yeah, there is the distinction of form and content, but something becomes the measure of that. So like the poles is like there's a universality of like we are all the poles, or like, you know, there are cultures who are like, what are you called? We are the people. And their enemies, they're the people we don't talk like, you know, but you have like 6 different cultures who are all called the people. It's universal, but it's particularized. So something has to hold it. I think that's what that deposit is that there is a containment to the universal. You don't see it, but you think it, you know?
Yeah.
I have the third theorem pulled up right now if I could read it. It's
Sure.
very short.
And that's all I had to say.
That's excellent. Thank you. Yeah, no, this is essential. Please. Why don't you read it and then we'll go to Matilda.
Yeah, so the third theorem in the first chapter, the principle of pure reason or practical reason, he says right here, theorem 3, if a rational being is to think of his maxims as practical universal laws, then he can think of them only as principles that contain the determining basis of the will, not by their matter, but merely by their form. The matter of practical principle is the object of the will. This object either is the determining basis of the will or it is not. If it were to be the will's determining basis, then the rule of the will would be the subject to an empirical condition vis-a-vis to the determining presentation's relation to the feeling of pleasure and displeasure, and consequently would not be a practical law. Now, if from a law all the matter, every object of the will is separated as determining basis, nothing remains of the law but the mere form of the universal legislation. And then he says right here that lastly, therefore a rational being either cannot think of his subjectivity practical principles, maxims at the same time as universal laws at all, or he must assume that the principles mere form by itself alone, whereby they are fitting for universal legislation, makes them practical laws.
Can you continue, because in the remark is example.
Oh, yeah, in the comment? Yeah.
The remark, I don't know if
yeah, remark or comic. Yeah,
it says the most understand. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just read the short sentence. or two sentences. He says, what form in a maxim is fitting for universal legislation and what form is not can be distinguished without instruction by the commonest understanding. I have, for example, made it my maxim to increase my assets by every safe means. Now I have a deposit in my hands, the owner of which is deceased and has left no record of it. Naturally, this is a case for my maxim. You want me to keep going, or
Yeah, continue
Yeah,
because
might
it's
as
not
well.
done.
Yeah. Now I want only to know whether that maxim can also hold as a universal practical law. I therefore apply the maxim to the present case and ask whether it could indeed take the form of a law, and I could thus indeed at the same time give through my maxim such a law as this, that everyone may deny a deposit which no one can prove to him to have been made. I immediately become aware that such a principle as a law would annihilate itself, because it would bring it about that there would be no deposits at all. A practical law that I cognize as such must qualify for universal legislation, that this is an identical proposition and therefore self-evident. Now, if I say that my will is subject to a practical law, then I cannot cite my inclinations, in the present case my greed, as my will's determining basis fitting for a universal practical law. For this inclination, far from being suitable for a universal legislation, rather must, in the form of universal law, erase itself.
Mm.
Yeah. That was really helpful.
Mm-hmm. I see. So it's like 3 or 4 options in relationship to how one can maintain the proper puritanical distance from pathological self-interest in the case of the deposit itself. How one remains kind of subtracted from it.
If you go like just a little below to the very end of the comment, it kind of ends with a quotation of, "Oh, marvelous harmony, what he wants, she also wants," and then end of quote, etc. Or to what is reported about the pledge made by King Francis I against Emperor Charles V. What my brother Charles wants to have, Milan, I also want to have. Empirical determining bases are not suitable for any universal external legislation,
Mm.
but just as little also for an internal one. For each person lays at the basis of the inclination his own subject, but another person another subject, and in each subject himself now this inclination, and now another is superior in influence. Discovering a law that under this condition would govern them all, with accordance on all sides, is absolutely impossible.
Mm. I see. So now we should reread what Lacan says about this once more, perhaps. And then we can go to Matilda, perhaps. Would you mind rereading, Matan, what he says while it's fresh for us?
Yeah, am I reading the section on the deposit?
Yeah, please. Just kind of start a few sentences before that so we're
Yeah,
clear.
sure. For this maxim, the one he talks about with regard to always enjoying yourself to constitute a law, or pardon me, just the imperative, the universal imperative, it is necessary and sufficient that, being put to the test of such reason, the maxim may be considered universal as far as logic is concerned. This does not mean, let us recall what logic entails, that it forces itself on everyone, but rather it is valid in every case, or better stated, that it is not valid in any case if it is not valid in every case. But this test, which must be based on pure, though practical reason, can only be passed by maxims of the type that allows for analytic deduction. Okay. This type is illustrated by the faithfulness required in returning a deposit. We can get some shut-eye after making a deposit, knowing that the depositary must remain blind to any condition that would oppose this faithfulness. In other words, there is no deposit without a depositary worthy of his task. One
Got it.
can sense
Please. No, go ahead.
One can sense the need for a more synthetic foundation, even in such an obvious case. At the risk of some irreverence, let me in turn illustrate the flaw in it with a maxim by Father Yubu that I have modified slightly. Long live Poland, for if there were no Poland, there would be no Poles. Let no one, out of some slowness of wit or emotivity, doubt my attachment to a freedom without which the people mourn. But while the analytic explanation of it here is irrefutable, its indefectibility, the fact that it cannot have defects, is tempered a little bit by the observation that the Poles have always been known for their remarkable resistance to the eclipses of Poland, and even to the lamentation that ensued. And of course, people continue making deposits even in situations where that might not be economically guaranteed, that the future gains of their deposits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, one can see immediately the trappings of Karatani's claim that Kant is the first socialist. Pretty clearly, right? Because commodity exchange would violate all of these careful analytic deductions.
But I think going to what we talked about last week, what we briefly touched on, it's the fact that he has like habits, that he's kind of stuck in his situation based off his habits. So in a sense, yeah, he's as you said, a socialist, but he's also, a liberal who, underneath it all, at least, underneath the words,
Oh yeah,
because he's consuming.
No, he's not a socialist. He's not a socialist from the get-go. He's not a socialist.
No.
No. That's the claim of Marxists that read Kant. It's that if one follows the Kantian kingdom of ends to the end, because there's a historical periodization that Karatani points out, which is that Kant created a movement called associationism that would be a shelter from the early form of capitalism he encountered called mercantile capitalism, which was much less pernicious than commodity capitalism. But even mercantile capitalism wasn't good enough for Kant, so he wanted to create like confederations that were subtracted from it, so that a form of exchange could transpire that maintained human dignity more adequately, I guess, right? So like Kantian economics is what I'm driving at. Has to be socialistic, I guess you could say. Non-coercive, not based on domination, etc. It has to be utopian in some way.
I think the contrary, like I think this is in a way the ideology that deters any socialistic impulse, because like for example you can say, okay, what's the problem of the world? Some people will say, many conservatives will say, oh, it's because people are not good, right? They are not in Kant way, they're not loyal to